an extended period of time. And acceptability. Technologies do not exist separate from society. There is a need for extensive engagement with stakeholders and publics. Proposed techniques will only work if they are aligned with other societal goals and values. The structure of the event is as follows. The keynote talk will be delivered by Alexandre Paquot, Director at DG Clima, and will be followed by the launch of our vision for an EU CDR strategy by my colleagues at CarbonGap. We will focus on 4 pillars of the strategy. This will be done through panel discussions in 2 sets of 2 parallel sessions. In each session, one panel discussion will take place on this level, and the other one will take place on the floor above. Details are behind me. We will round things off with a plenary session back here to discuss the outcomes of the panels, and that will be followed by lunch. Please feel free to not only eat the delicious food that will be here, but also network with each other and the CarbonGap team, who will be very happy to answer your questions. I would now like to invite you to join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Alexandre Paquot, to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, colleagues. I'm very pleased to be with you, and thank you very much for inviting me, and colleagues as well, because a couple of my colleagues are also in the room. I'm here to kickstart the day, but I'm also here to listen to you, because I think we're very keen to discuss, engage with all of you, and listen to the vision that you will present during the course of today. Let me start by giving a bit of the context of where we stand today. First, it is very clear that we must stay on course with regard to climate action. There is no alternative. And that was repeated a couple of weeks ago when the Commission adopted its communication on the 2040 targets. And there, the conclusion is clear. We need to stay on course, and we need to invest as much as possible and as fast as possible. And that leads to the Commission recommending this 90% reduction by 2040 as the most cost-effective way of reaching our climate neutrality objective by 2050. This is key for EU competitiveness because others are going very fast. China, US, many others, we're not alone anymore in this challenging pathway. Also, in this communication, we made it very clear that one of the key conditions for reaching our long-term objective is to really realize and implement the 2030 targets and policies that we have adopted during the course of the last year. So this is the top priority, 2030 implementation. It is done through, of course, national actions. It's done through stakeholders' actions. But having decisions made on the ground by key operators is absolutely key to happen during this decade. So that's about the big picture and where we stand. So what does it mean for carbon removals? That's the topic of today. What is very clear also, and we made it also very clearly in the documents that we adopted recently, is that emission reduction is the top priority. This is what needs to happen. But at the same time, preserving carbon sink remain a priority, as well as developing carbon removal solutions. Because carbon removal solutions will have to play a key role to compensate residual emissions in the hard-to-abate sectors. When we look at the numbers, because our strategy is underpinned by very detailed modeling work, we see that by 2040, the level of emissions will be less than 850 million tons. And carbon removals, so land-based as well as industrial carbon removals, up to 400 million tons. So we're talking big numbers here. We're talking about a challenging move towards this higher level of removals. So what are we doing to address this challenge? And these are only first steps, and we know that more will need to be done, and also, as we will hear today, there will be future also policy developments in this field. So we have started by creating a framework for carbon removal certification, CRCF. Now, I guess this is common to many of you, but that's a very, very important first step, because without building trust, really understanding that we can have very robust carbon removals developed, we cannot go really much beyond that in terms of policy. So the carbon removal certification, which was approved by the co-legislator just a couple of weeks ago, now sets clearly the frame in terms of how to develop the methodologies for carbon farming, permanent storage, and storage in products. And that will bring transparency, environmental integrity, as well as creating a very standardized and solid methodologies for these different type of activities. And the aim is really to boost innovative carbon removal technologies as well as sustainable carbon farming solutions in the respect of biodiversity and also fighting greenwashing. This is really the objective also, as I said, to increase the trust in carbon removals. That is going to be key to attract and mobilize private finance. So now we have the framework agreed by the co-legislator, but that's just the start, because what needs to be done is to develop these methodologies for each of these activities. And this is why we have set up an expert group, and I'm sure some of you are part of this expert group or will contribute or will listen in or will provide inputs to the work of this expert group, which is now created since a couple of months already. And the first meeting after the approval of the carbon removals will take place in April, and we will already start discussing on the basis of some reflection that we, together with our consultants, have been putting together. And the objective is first delegated act on these methodologies next year. So we are quite, I would say, we need to go quite fast with these methodologies. So that's the first thing that we have now engaged towards. And the second is, we all know that, okay, fine, we can capture the CO2, be from nature-based or from technological emissions, but we need to store the carbon. And that's one of the key gaps we see today in Europe, the lack of storage capacities for carbon. And this is why we have proposed, as part of the Net Zero Industrial Act, these 50 million tons of injection capacity, putting an obligation for the first time on oil and gas operators to develop this injection capacity across Europe. And here, the legislation has been adopted, and we are moving forward with the implementation. Now, my last point is about the overall strategy. Because without a clear view on where is our vision, I think it's going to be hard to set the right coherent policy framework. And this is why, together with the 2040 communication, we adopted a sister communication, which is the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy. And that sets key milestones and policy initiatives to really set up this support for carbon removals without putting at risk, as I said, emission reduction or environmental integrity. We look in this strategy at three pathways: CCS, removals, and CCU, with as a horizontal issue the transport of CO2 across Europe, because we need to create really a single market for CO2. On the policy side, what are we going to do in the next couple of years? First, we will assess overall objectives for carbon removals in the context of the 2040 target and in the context of the upcoming reviews of the key legislation that will take place by 2026. So we will consider options and support mechanisms to allow the policy framework to recognize and valorize carbon removals. We will look if and how carbon removals can be accounted and covered by the EU ETS. And I know colleagues are here. We are responsible for the carbon market, and I'm sure they can go more in detail about that. We will also look at how to boost research and innovation and the deployment, because that's absolutely key to lower costs and increase certainty around the impacts. And there I would like just to say a few words about a very important instrument that we see to really scale up these technologies, which is the Innovation Fund. It's a fund which is created thanks to the EU ETS, because that's the auctioning of the allowances that allows the fund to exist. We have about 40 billion euros available for this decade. And today, we have about 6 billion euros, which is already committed for a very excellent project to decarbonize industry, but also support clean tech. And if we look at the portfolio of projects which are being supported, we see that about half of them concern CCUS. So we see a clear also understanding from the sector itself that this is a very important technology. So we are at a very exciting time for carbon removals. We will have to mobilize all efforts. And as I said, very keen to listen to you and have this debate with you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will now ask my colleague Sylvain Delerce, who is our Associate Research Director, to talk to you a bit more about what we've been working on for not too far from, I think, 8 months now. It's been taking a lot of our energy and a lot of our optimism on board, and we hope we can communicate that with you.
Thank you. I don't know if this is working. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us. So my name is Sylvain Delerce. As Clotilde said, I'm an Associate Research Director at CarbonGap. It means a lot to me to be here today to discuss with you the project of having a proper and comprehensive CDR strategy for Europe. It was 2017 when I started to transition to carbon removals, resigned and reoriented my career. I was looking for more radical solutions to climate change, something that could allow us to dream of something better than just limiting a catastrophe. And I found this in carbon removal. My transition included a PhD in geochemistry. I'm not sure I recommend that to anyone, but it's been an incredible journey, to be honest, to witness the emergence of this new sector and of this new breed of climate solutions. Now, here we are, 2024, and CDR is a reality. CDR is in motion. We'll come back to that in the presentation. Whichever way you look at the climate crisis, CDR is needed to stabilize the climate. And it is already baked in a series of targets, either explicitly or implicitly. But the pace of CDR policy is becoming a bottleneck progressively, and that could threaten our capacity to stay on the safe side of climate change. So this pervasive climate policy gap, is what CarbonGap proposes to tackle with a comprehensive CDR strategy in the EU. The EU must rise to the challenge, and now. We'll come back also to that in the presentation. We only have about 25 years to stabilize the climate system now, and the momentum that exists in CDR won't last under current conditions. So again, this is why we're calling today for a CDR strategy. We've worked on the design of such a strategy, and it's been, as Clotilde said, very much of a teamwork. So I'm honored to present this to you today with the slides. Before we start, we would like to engage with you a little bit with a quick question. So we will use a Slido. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this kind of tools. If we can put up the QR code, please, for the Slido. We'll ask you a very simple question and give you some minutes to share your views. So you can either use the QR code on the screen or go to slido.com and input the code that you see on the screen to access the question. All right. Can we put up the answers on the screen progressively? Right. So this is an open question. You should be able to share your thoughts using words that we should see coming up on the screen, exactly. So what is missing for the current EU policy landscape to further develop and deploy carbon removal to the next level? Funding is apparently an important ingredient. Business case. I'd be curious to know if we're talking short-term, medium-term, or long-term, but I guess all of them. Targets, I can see climate justice safeguards. What else do we see? Strong guardrails, science and business case, clarity on use of certificates, separate targets. A lot of ingredients. There's a lot of work to be done. Okay. That's very interesting. So the prominent ones were definitely funding, business case, separate targets, and inclusion in the ETS. A long debate. Thank you very much for your answer. You can keep posting them, I get, and we can come back to that later. Let's go with the presentation now. So in the few slides that are coming, I will share with you the overview of this strategy we are publishing today. So we start with some basic things to remind everyone. I think everyone in this room is familiar with the definition of carbon dioxide removal, but it's always important to restate it and also to differentiate it from other methods like CCS and CCU. So the point on this slide, because you all know this, I guess, is really to remember us that the diversity of CDR methods that exist is an asset that we need to cultivate, because that's how we will be successful in scaling up. So I put on the screen the four main families of CDR. Biomass conversion, which is about stabilizing biomass or extracting its carbon to store it. Enhancing ecosystems and their natural ability to suck carbon out of the air and store it. Geochemical methods that are about essentially speeding up natural processes that occurs between the rocks, air, and water, and synthetic methods that involve industrial processes. Okay, I can switch. So yeah, diversity is what we need to keep in mind and we need to cultivate in the strategy. So what is at stake and why do we need CDR? Again, I guess most of you know that very well here, but we need it to counter the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and manage potentially the level of overshoot to avoid reaching tipping point. When we head towards net zero, we need carbon removal to enable net zero and be able to neutralize residual emissions. And then it's already stated in different official texts and laws. There is a net negative phase after that that is very important, particularly for geographies like Europe. And the magnitude of the challenge is quite huge. According to IPCC and State of the CDR report, we might need between 5 and 10 gigatons CO2 removed every year by 2050, which means that there is an enormous scale-up challenge ahead of us. Okay, in the next two slides, I'd like to go into where is CDR now and why we could say that it is somehow at crossroads. In the last 3 to 4 years, significant progress has been made on CDR overall in the world, but also in the EU, and particularly on awareness, policy, and implementation. So CDR is now recognized as the third pillar of climate action. So that's reduce, adapt, and removed, and that's stated in many prominent publications and assemblies like G20, COP20, COP in general. So there is a strong consensus around this idea now. Because of that, some CDR policy has started to emerge in the EU and elsewhere. Alexandre mentioned very good examples in the EU of how CDR policy is emerging with CRCF, Green Claims, NZIA, and all these texts. And it's also amazing to see the number of companies has skyrocketed in these years. The volumes that are purchased and delivered have also grown significantly. So that means that the sector is in motion and that there is a strong momentum to keep growing it. Now, this is only the beginning of the story. Also, as Alexandre was saying right before, we have to scale this industry by a massive scale, and that comes with new challenges and also reveals new limitations of the current conditions. First, we can mention the ambiguity that remains around the ambition on CDR and where it is all going on the medium to long term, and that's potentially holding back investment, demand, and supply. The current policy framework remains fragmented in a way. We do have different bills touching on different aspects of CDR, but we miss that cohesive plan that we are discussing today, and that leaves in important gaps unaddressed right now. Also, for EU CDR entrepreneurs, it is still not straightforward and easy to find the support they need to scale up their projects and their technologies, and some methods are still under-researched. Finally, we can also mention that strong concerns remain regarding the governance of CDR, and that is a roadblock that all of us have identified for a long time, and we need to work on that to avoid potential limitation very soon. So for these reasons, we have the momentum, and we have a whole set of new challenges that we're facing for the scale-up of CDR. We need to act now, and the EU cannot afford to wait, particularly not to use the momentum that exists. So again, that's why today we are calling for a new EU CDR strategy, and that strategy has the following structure. There are what we call enabling conditions on which the EU has already made significant progress. The first is about setting targets and providing a direction of travel for the sector. So that's 2040 targets and the EU climate law, where we already have a fairly good idea of what the EU is aiming for. But it could be further developed, particularly in how we break things down and with separate targets and nested targets for different kinds of removals. Then about clarifying the rules of the game and build the trust within the sector. As it was mentioned, the CRCF is a huge step forward for the EU. It has solved several issues on the way, and I think the version that's been voted is really good. There are still, again, here some work to be done, particularly on the regulation of use cases, for example, to further develop these conditions. And then finally, on the physical infrastructure that is needed to transport and store this CO2. Again, here the EU has made a lot of progress with the ICMS, but these texts were not specifically tailored for CDR, so we consider that there's a need for a clear assessment if the needs of CDR will be met with the current version of this text, or if they need some amendments. If we are able to further develop these enabling conditions, the 4 pillars we introduced today, or we also call them proactive measures, are what we need to go further. So I will present them more into detail, but the first one is about boosting investment in research and innovation. The second one is about creating deployment incentives to accompany the scale-up of the CDR methods. Then the third one is about developing the long-term vision and logic for the CDR market. And the fourth one is about ensuring that this deployment is done in a just way. So we'll come back to this in more detail. Before we move on from this slide, what is important is this square. These pillars are designed to work together and won't be successful in isolation. So that's why we are calling for this cohesive strategy, because we can't keep addressing different aspects of the industry separately. Okay, so let's dive into the first pillar, which is about boosting research and innovation. First, I want to mention that this is both needed and strategic for the EU. First, the first goal is to reduce uncertainty. We have a huge diversity of existing CDR methods, but some of them still have to go through stage gate or to validate their performances on technical aspects or even societal performances. So to confirm this, we need to invest further in research and innovation to further test each of the concepts and make sure that they are scalable, so that we don't rely or have oversight expectations on methods that might not be able to perform as much as we want them to. The second objective is to cultivate, we come back to this, the diversity of method, broadening the range of viable CDR methods. This can be done by different approaches. The first one is to optimize existing CDR methods. Some of them exist, but their performances do not allow them to scale, so we need to work on their consumption of resources, energy, minerals, whatever. The second angle is to answer critical questions that are holding back some of the methods. I'm thinking open system, ocean alkalinity, and this kind of methods. Some answers are not here, and therefore the society will never provide a mandate to scale up. So we need to answer this question. Then we can also keep researching for new CDR approaches. I think all of you have followed that this is a vibrant ecosystem. New approaches are constantly being proposed, so there is probably room to find even more diversity of methods. Then the EU also needs to be in the competition and create EU champions. We all know that this market is poised to grow significantly. So we need to invest now to be in the game and to support all these entrepreneurs that exist in the EU to retain talent or even attract more and have the capacity to generate the removals we need or even export them. And finally, we need to gear up on CDR governance. We already mentioned that in the introduction. This is a new sector, this is a new breed of climate solutions, so we need also to ask ourselves what is the right governance and what is the governance that can create trust within the sector. So our recommendation, you will see them in the paper, they are more detailed than this, but they are mostly about making the funding more accessible, committing more funding, and making the funding more targeted as well, so that CDR can really rely on dedicated funding streams without having to compete with other clean techs, for example. I'll move on to the second pillar. So this one is about creating the deployment incentives that the sector needs to scale up. Here, the idea is really to accelerate this learning curve, particularly for these methods where we have now more to learn in the field than in the lab. So they need support to perform their exploratory scale-up in a way and test really in real conditions. It's been true in the past for other clean techs like wind and solar, for example, and the EU has been quite successful at supporting these sectors. So there is confidence that this can be repeated. One particularity of CDR is that it currently faces extra uncertainty, particularly on the long term, for this big market or big demand that we'll need that is not yet fully organized. So that's why deployment incentives are even more important. These deployment incentives share three main characteristics. They are predictable and sizable. They are long-lasting, and they are based on a high credibility of takers and resilient to political cycles. So that creates really the credibility for the investors to rely on them. They have, deployment incentives are potentially based mostly on public funding in the beginning, but very soon they will unleash private funding sources. As soon as a method is backed by the public funding, it's changed the game completely for investors. So that's also something we want to create with this. And that's also a good way for the EU to enshrine good practices on how you procure CDR, what kind of CDR you support, and for what uses. So I'll go very quickly on the recommendation. I will invite you to go to the paper to read them. But and there are many options for deployment incentives. We have landed on one approach, which is to create a pilot procurement program with a first phase based essentially on public funding, and a second one very soon after, where you could mix public and private funding to accelerate the deployment. The pillar 3 is about answering the question of the long-term logic for scaling CDR and buying huge amount of CDR. So, yeah. Unlike solar or wind, the market for CDR needs to be created, a little bit like a waste management system or public services that needs a regulation to create a market. And so that's what we explore in Pillar 3, creating this long-term logic. The message here is that we are convinced, and that's reflected in the paper, that to achieve that, we need to stack different mechanisms. We can't rely on only one, say, ETS or any version of ETS integration, for example. So we've come up with a bunch of recommendations exploring how we could use different approaches and stack them so that at the end we have a high confidence that we are able to achieve the huge volumes because we are not betting on just one approach. So also, this long-term logic needs to readily consider going beyond compensation of residual emissions and also going beyond net zero. Because on the long term, these are the instruments that we will need to keep scaling up and up the demand and the market for CDR, even after net zero. And as we do that, of course, we potentially create a new market, compliance market, or burden for economic actors. So that we also need to design this while thinking of this, what we call the CDR diplomacy, and how we make sure we can articulate what is created in the EU versus the global market, a little bit like ETS and CBAM to protect the competitiveness of our economic actors. So essentially, there is a strong focus on land sync and how we can, again, stack different mechanisms to reach the desired targets. To explore how we can embed CDR in existing EU legislations. We propose to change the focus from only integration into ETS1 and to consider alternatives such as a removal trading scheme, and to implement potentially CDR targets into an effort sharing regulation. Final pillar, pillar 4, which is about ensuring that the deployment of CDR is made right and in a just manner. First, because it is an existing commitment of the EU. The EU has already committed to a just and inclusive green transition, so CDR should be no exception to that. But also because there is a need to build this trust among all stakeholders. So, and in them, of course, there is the general public, but also for investors, buyers, and all the different stakeholders, we need to create the commitment that the market we are creating will last and won't crash on similar issues as we have witnessed in the past. So that's very important. In the strategy, we've tried also to make recommendation that allows us to use the climate justice principles, which are described in the presentation, in the paper, and to turn them into real measures, with actionable measures, so that they don't remain just concepts that we want to respect, but there is actually a way to enforce them. And another strong idea here is to create the conditions to decentralize the initiative on CDR. A little bit like, so we call it the Carbon Removal Communities Initiatives. That's largely inspired on the similar concept on renewables. And we think that's quite powerful to provide the tools so that communities can learn, understand CDR, and then take the initiative. Okay, I'm almost done. On this visual, the idea is to illustrate how we see these different pillars work with each other in time. And what is important here is to see that they are stacking each other, they overlap in time, they are phased, and they are complementary. So again, insisting on the fact that they don't work in isolation, but they work together because they have cross dependencies and they deliver outcomes that one need. And so yeah, they depend on each other essentially. All right, so some key takeaways. While preparing this strategy, we have realized that the EU is completely equipped to scale CDR. That the EU has experience in developing clean tech, so there is confidence that the EU can do that again. But it's more than time to go to the next level and build on the progress made on these enabling conditions and go to the next level implementing the 4 pillars. So these are the new measures that are required, and in the paper you will find 18 of them gathered in these 4 pillars. Okay, I finished my presentation with this citation from Leonard Bernstein: to achieve great things, we need 2 things, a plan and not quite enough time. I think we all agree here that the second condition is met, so now we need the plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hope this was insightful enough to urge you to go and read our publication. The physical copies are coming in the building as I'm speaking. But for all of you who are tech savvy, you can read it online. We have a great PDF that's available on our website, and you can read it through the QR codes scattered around this building. I think you wanted to go back to your Slido just to recap a bit on the temperature of the room.
Yeah, and there is a second question, if we can put it up, please.
Great.
Okay, so that's the second question. If you want to go back, it's the same slide, I guess, the same number. And we are asking you, what are the most important outcomes from the adoption of a CDR strategy in Europe? I hope it was somehow clear in the presentation that this strategy could achieve different outcomes. So yeah, we would be curious to know for you what would be the most important ones.
I think this is a good reflection of the word cloud that we had earlier. Funding seems to be the priority again.
All right, so results are stabilizing. The first is definitely about unleashing private funding and investment in CDR. Second would be ensuring that CDR is deployed in a just and equitable manner. And then fostering action with the member states. And finally, enabling the research community to answer open questions on CDR. Great, thank you very much for participating in this second question. So, should we move on to the...
We'll move on to a short coffee break, because you probably want a bit of a break, and for those of you who didn't get the time to mingle beforehand. And then we will move to our the first parallel panel session, taking place for 15 minutes between 10 and 10:50, so we ask you to be ready to split in the room that you would rather join, either here, in the same room downstairs, or upstairs, next to the lobby. You will find a big room with seats settled all across the room. This would be if you want to attend the discussion on a future CDR compliance market. Here are key questions that we'll be approaching. If you're interested in what's in the EU's toolbox to boost the supply of high-quality carbon removal, stay seated. It's right here. I see most of you have moved to the room that interests you, but if some of you still wish to go upstairs, now is the time. As a reminder, upstairs we will be talking about a CDR compliance market.
Hi. Okay. All right. Welcome to this session. Please take a seat. All the panelists are here. We're good to go. All right. So thank you for joining this session. As Clotilde explained in the introduction, the idea of this separate session is to go a little bit deeper into each of the pillars and explore specific questions with a panel that I will soon introduce. So this session is about the second pillar, so deployment incentives. As I mentioned in the presentation, they are a key element of the scale-up of carbon removal for different reasons, and they can also achieve different outcomes. We will explore that during the conversation. Historically, deployment incentives such as subsidy schemes have been instrumental in scaling other climate technologies such as wind and solar. And if we want to durably remove carbon from the atmosphere, at the scale of million tons per year by 2050. Such incentives are needed, again, as I said, to support the lab exits and exploratory scale-up, in which we take the CDR methods into the real world, test them, and gather data that will then increase certainty about the scale at which we can deploy them. So the panel consists of 4 speakers. They will each get a chance to have their say on how we can deploy and scale up CDR, zooming on deployment incentives. Then I will open the discussion among the panelists. And finally, we will have around 10 to 15 minutes for question and answer to the audience. So please prepare your questions as we go. And then a colleague of mine will come to you with a microphone to take the questions. So we also have a rapporteur for this session. So Chris Sherwood will take good notes and follow the conversation, and he will be in charge of sharing the content of the session later when we gather again for the plenary. So thank you, Chris, for accepting this role. And yeah, with that, we're good to go. So I'd like to kick off the discussions turning to the European Commission with Alexandre Paquot that we already introduced. So Director for the DG Clima unit on innovation for a low carbon resilient economy. So the European Commission, as you said in your introduction, has recently put out a communication setting out its thinking on the contribution of carbon removals for the 2040 climate targets and the role to be played by industrial carbon removal. So I'd like to ask you to start with, what specific policies will be needed to deploy different carbon removal in Europe at the pace and scale needed? The floor is yours. And yeah, if you want to grab the mic.
Thank you very much. I will be short because I've already said quite a lot in my introduction. So, and I would like to listen to the other panelists and you. But I can say that, of course, in terms of incentive, we have to look in terms of regulatory incentive and financial incentive. So the regulatory incentive for us means that we will be looking in the next couple of years, so until 2026, into policy options, such as integration of carbon removals or certain carbon removals into DTS, setting specific targets, I think as you have also listed in your recommendations. And in terms of the funding incentives here, clearly continuing the support in terms of research and innovation, as I said as well. So the next Horizon Europe program, we really hope, will also play a key role in this. And in terms of how to scale up this type of technologies, there also you have a number of ideas in your report, be in terms of procurement, be in terms of voluntary carbon markets, be in terms of auction. That could be also an option. So things are still pretty open. What one will have to keep in mind is, of course, we are coming into a situation where the constraints of the EU budget is going to increase. So with Ukraine, with the defense being top priorities, of course, for Europe, it means that there will be another look at the budget. So here we will also need to look at not only EU solutions, but also national solutions. And here the EU ETS revenues are also very important stream of revenues that can be used also to support CDM deployment. So still many open questions, I would say. So I'm here more to listen to you and the others.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just a follow-up before we move to the next panelist, because of course some member states have already taken some initiatives and are working or proposing specific schemes to support actually specific CDR methods. So I'm wondering how you look at it. Do you see that this can be complementary and work together with potentially new deployment incentive the EU would create? Is it an do you find it inspiring to design like or replicate a similar model at the EU level? Yeah. How do you use these experiences?
Oh, sure. We are very keen to learn from these national experiences because, as we said since this morning, this is a very nascent market, so we need to look into how to stimulate it as best as possible in the most cost-effective way. So yes, at this stage, we are really very much into looking at what is happening in Europe, but also elsewhere.
Great. Thank you very much for these introductory remarks. I'll go next to Sven Clement. So we have the pleasure to have Sven Clement from Luxembourg. He's MP from the Pirate Party in the Luxembourg Parliament. So in your role as an MP, you have proposed a bill to foster the development of novel CDR methods through a negative emission tariff in Luxembourg. If adopted, it would create direct subsidies for mid-sized projects for CO2 air capture and CO2 sequestration. So my question is, what role can national initiatives like this play in developing CDR? And maybe you can start with an update on this specific proposal that is very interesting.
And thank you, Sylvain. Thank you for having me. Actually, I'm probably the least qualified person to be here because I'm a policymaker and we need to hear from the sector what we should be doing or not be doing. But if I'm looking at the numbers and also at the introduction this morning, I see that the main problem is not demand. We have oversold the capacity to sequester CO2 by huge margins, to be honest. So the question is not how can we stimulate demand, the question is more how can we stimulate the offer. And there we need to create whatever markets we can create. And one of the solutions I came up with, together with a huge team of participative dialogue, was to look at what worked in the past. And what worked in the past was for solar installations to really get a rocket start when they introduced the first negative tariffs. So if the injection tariffs that we created on solar were like the inspiration on how can we boost the offer of CDR. And part of that solution is then the negative emissions tariff, which we called then the ALNET proposal for Luxembourg negative emissions tariff proposal, which essentially says we start with very high price, and then based on the market conditions, we reduce the negative emissions tariff as soon as certain thresholds of offer are being met. That should guarantee that nobody gets too rich, but at the same time we create the right incentives to use taxpayer money where it's really needed. That bill has been proposed about a year ago. Luxembourg has a very strange system. We are unicameral, so we have only one parliament, but we have a so-called Council of State, which is a almost second chamber, which advises every bill that gets introduced. And they, last week, published their opinion on our bill, which essentially said, well, we don't see the opportunity why we should do that nationally. We should wait for the EU to do something, which is a very strange thing to say as a legislator to like, I don't want to work. I just want to wait for somebody else to do my work. So we are now using all the arguments we have, and we will reply to that opinion in committee so that we can move the bill forward and hopefully really have that debate in plenary on what and how we can create that offer. Because demand side, if we are looking at the big commitments by the big spenders in the CDR space, we see that they are willing to buy at quite reasonable prices. The problem is that not enough offer is on the market to actually sequester that CO2. So my bill is more oriented to boost the offer than the demand side.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting because that's a very concrete example of one country taking an initiative and then potentially waiting for the EU. We'll see. But that's very interesting. Also, how the project was conceived was very inspiring. In creating this bill, Sven, what other mechanism have you reviewed, and how did you land it on this particular approach?
If you want to boost anything, you can have direct funding. You can simply spend money or do call for tenders and then just look at whoever wants your free money, essentially. That works not that well, to be honest. We do that mostly in defense spending. And, well, we see how well our armies have been equipped over the last years, so that we are already scrambling after 2 years of a war. So I came from that perspective of how can we create a durable, a sustainable solution to really jumpstart the market. And so we looked at what worked in the past. Direct spending, direct funding works at the prototype phase. It's nice to have Horizon 2020. It's very important to boost academia, to boost the initial tech transfer. But the moment you try to commercialize something, you need to have a market, but you also need to be able to scale up, and you have to have access to private capital. Private capital normally wants at least certain guarantees when they enter a new market that they have no clue about. And the main issue when it comes to CDR is that it's a market that nobody really knows what guarantees they have that, for one side, the technology works, and second, that the market actually exists. You can have letter of intents. Those are worth exactly nil if, in the end, your tech doesn't work or doesn't work as promised. So the goal was really to provide incentives also for the private sector to invest into CDR projects. And so we also introduced that question of what are we aiming for? So at the one hand, you have carbon capture and usage, CCU, that will play a role to transition shipping, transition the airline industry. A ship that we buy today will not be decarbonized before 2050. Simply impossible. So the question is, how can we transition those ships? So we need to have something for the usage, a lower tariff, and a higher tariff if you want to store it durably. Because also, who will pay for cleaning up the mess somebody else made in the past? Well, traditionally, it's to a certain extent the taxpayer. So that's also the reason why we opted for a negative emissions tariff, which can play a role in ETS, because that will actually be a second pillar of financing. You can have financing through ETS, and then you can get the negative emissions tariff on top, so that it's financially viable to actually sequester durably the CO2 that you capture. So that's a bit the analysis with it.
Thank you very much. You touched on a question that I think is a little bit of a sticky problem. It's always, are we demand or supply constrained, right? And you have all kind of approaches to that. So I think it's a good segue to go to our next panelist, Paolo Piffaretti, who's CEO and co-founder of CarbonX. So CarbonX is a private initiative that acts as a procurement and management partner for high durability and quality carbon dioxide removals, securing offtake agreements for CDR suppliers. Yeah, Paolo, maybe you can say a word of your vision from where you stand in the ecosystem, and then potentially touch on this question of supply demand and what's your perception on that.
So it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And it's a bit of a surprise to hear that there is more demand than actual supply, since supply is very much conditional of the demand. And right now, what we're seeing is very much a trickle of large volume demand. I would say a serious bankable demand. And I think there's many reasons for why that is the case, but you touched upon it, and I think we're lacking certainty. Today, there is no clear guidance as to how these carbon removal credits will be applied, how can they be implemented, and I think the private sector is very much waiting for such a confirmation, an indication as to how these will be used. And from the moment we get that, we will start seeing much bigger commitments coming from the private sector. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe you could share a little bit more on precisely these actors. What is holding them back from purchasing, and how deployment incentives that we've discussed under Pillar 2 could change a little bit the game on that?
I think what we need to understand is the CDR industry is very much an infrastructure industry, and so for it to scale to climate relevance, what we need is project financing. Project financing is done only on the back of bankable offtakes. And again, for bankable offtakes to take place, you need certainty, you need visibility. Where I think the European Commission or Europe could stand up also and provide maybe additional support is in, for instance, facilitating funds that guarantee that bankability of the offtakes, of these purchases, for then infrastructure funds to feel comfortable providing this project financing. When CarbonX talks about what the biggest risks are for the industry, we always talk about project financing. There is only so much that can be done with venture funds, and we already are, I believe, hitting some of a mark. And so it's really now time that we get to this phase of the market where we see larger volume offtakes take place and project financing step up.
Okay, and then maybe one last question for you, Paolo, is also about this momentum we've described in the introduction that the sector is experiencing. But there are some also say that there are some concerns that maybe the VCM is also stalling a little bit, or I don't know, do you have a view on that from where you stand?
No, so where I do agree, however, is that given that there is a sort of a growing clarity as to the fact that permanent carbon removals will be eventually enforced, we're seeing indeed a growing number of buyers coming into the market, and we're seeing very substantial RFPs taking place. Now in the growing hundreds of thousands of tons, which initially was almost unheard of. I mean, for us, the market really exists since 2 years, I would say. Last year we saw only a couple of purchases, maybe just 5 or less than 5, beyond the hundreds of thousands of tons. Now, at the very beginning of this year, we already are aware of multiple of these RFPs taking place. So I think there is a growing momentum on the demand side. I think this can be very much a market-driven industry. What it needs is certainty. What it needs is visibility to then, fully take place.
Okay, thank you very much, Paolo. I'll now go to Sabine Frank from Carbon Market Watch. Welcome, and thank you for being with us. Carbon Market Watch is an environmental NGO focused on emission reductions and acting as a watchdog for carbon markets. you also have a very interesting initiative right now. I don't know if you still hear me. Yeah, which is the Cool Down project. Maybe you will say a word about this, where you are also looking quite in depth on what could a CDR strategy look like. So yeah, I guess if you can say a word on that, and then also my question to you would be, what would be for you the best case scenario for the deployment of carbon removal in Europe, and with, again, a little bit of a focus on deployment incentive and how we can use it.
Thank you, Sylvain, and good morning. Yes, you said Carbon Market Watch focuses on emissions. That's right. We also work on removals. We have a much smaller team than Carbon Gap, but we try and keep up with Carbon Gap in that field. But the introduction is right in that, yes, we're still very much concerned with the emission reductions, well knowing what roles removals have to play, and that's why maybe you will find me, you'll think that I'm on the wrong panel with the remarks that I'm going to make, but I hope that overall they will still go in the right direction. When you ask about the best case scenario for carbon deployment, I want to say, first of all, the best case scenario is already gone, where we can't have that anymore, because that would have been one where we practically need no carbon removals. And so we're left with the second best scenario, which is to need minimal amounts of carbon removals to compensate for residual emissions, and then eventually to go into net negative territory, which is where CDR will really come into its own. So that to say, prioritizing emission reductions, especially in terms of how we spend our resources, and we've already had references on competing demands on budgets, not just from the climate field, but also from completely other fields. So that must be our focus. But that said, Carbon Gap is right in pointing out, to begin with in the paper, that there are CDR governance gaps. That is, that EU policy is not yet geared to ensure that carbon removals will play the role that they will need to play in reaching climate neutrality. And we can observe that in all relevant policy files so far, the focus is on CCS, CCU, and CDR for offsetting. So all the talk about carbon removals so far is very much focused still on dealing with emissions and not CDR for CDR's sake. There's a lot of education still to be done about the essential role of carbon removals. So therefore, we need clarity on the use case of CDR units. And I think that's where there is also still maybe a bit of unclarity in the Carbon Gap paper. To have clarity on the use case of CDR units means to be clear who pays, who benefits, and why are we doing them, why are we creating them in the first place. And as long as we do not have clarity on this use case, then we are in troubled waters when discussing specific policies for deploying carbon removals in the EU at the pace and the scale needed. To emphasize this even more, we cannot get any dedicated CDR policy instrument right until removals and emission reductions are clearly separated with 3 pillars of EU climate action. And I take great courage from Monsieur Paquot saying, we will set separate targets. I hope you haven't misspoken. If that is really coming, then that is a great development. And Carbon Gap is also very clear here. It calls in its paper for a union-wide binding target for carbon removal with nested targets for land-based and higher durability removals as an enabling condition for a CDR strategy. So kudos for being so absolutely clear about that. However, it would also be helpful if Carbon Gap's comprehensive carbon removal strategy would be clearer about the use case for carbon removals, as I have said, so as to translate the principle that CDR must complement but not substitute emission reductions well. This translation has to happen well. Otherwise, this carbon, what we call the carbon confusion, the confusion about what carbon removals are for, will continue to exist. It will continue to dominate the policy making space, and it will continue to stand in the way of the scale up of CDR. In particular, you will allow me a little bit of criticism of the strategy. What I felt throughout as I read the paper is that the demarcation of carbon removals from the offsetting of emissions that need to be reduced is not entirely clear. Rather, here and there, it seems that support for the use of carbon removals for offsetting purposes of non-residual emissions shines through. It seems to be a sort of compromise area of getting removals going for them eventually to fulfill their proper purpose. And that lack of demarcation then also leads to erroneous proposals such as the CDR integration in the ETS. We could say more about how you go about this in the paper, probably will come to that. I would say it's much better that Carbon Gap has taken up the proposal for the creation of a separate EU-wide removals trading system, because this is where the purchase of CDR units is an additional obligation and not an offsetting tool. And now finally, I'm supposed to satisfy any curiosity about the Cool Down project. It's called the Cool Down project for two reasons. One is it's about the cooling down of the climate, but it's also about the cooling down of a rather polarized debate on carbon removals. It's called A Common Vision, has the strapline, A Common Vision of Carbon Removals in the EU. But notably with this project, we're deliberately not prescriptive about the policy instruments for the deployment of carbon removals, but we seek to co-create suggestions for such instruments with a wide range of stakeholders. We have jokingly called our approach the poke bowl of CDR incentivization, because the idea is that we have to find the ideal combination of ingredients for CDR incentivization tools. We have to look what's the ideal ingredient from the finance domain, from the goal-setting domain, from the enabling a portfolio of CDR methods, from sustainability criteria, and the toolbox of governance mechanisms to put in place. We're in the middle of a workshop series. The second one is this Thursday. We'll have another one in April, and when all this is over, we will hopefully be able to publicize, to come out with some concrete proposals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine. And I think you're touching on very important points, particularly on the governance and the uses and all these aspects. At the same time, I guess the context we have painted in the introduction is still very much true, with this momentum that we don't want to lose, because if we are successful at fixing this governance issue, we want the CDR methods to be able to deliver the megatons we need. So I was wondering if you have already some preferences on what kind of deployment incentives would be best suited for that and the governance around them.
I don't want to commit myself entirely. I think we're still very much into getting the governance right. That is getting the target setting and the revision of the EU climate law right. We've also only just had the passage of the CRCF, and we are not entirely happy with the CRCF. It has produced some very problematical results. Beyond that, our thinking goes in the direction of needing separate instruments for the incentivization of CDR, and to caution against the use of any tools we already have, which are designed to help the emission reductions, to repurpose them to also serve the incentivization of CDR, because with that we're simply in too dangerous territory.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll now go with a question that any one of you can take, so feel free to step up if you're inspired. The first one, I guess, is that these deployment incentives we've been discussing, again, there is a huge variety of them. In the paper, we have focused on a particular one, but we have already seen others being deployed elsewhere, particularly in the US. And they can serve different purposes. You can use them to accelerate significantly on volumes, for example, because you put money and you buy volumes and you want to meet your targets. You can use them as a forcing function to reduce prices. That's what the US is doing, particularly. You can also use them as a vehicle to enshrine good practices on how to purchase CDR, which kind of CDR should be purchased. So And I'm wondering, if you have a take on this, if the EU was to implement some sort of deployment incentives, and maybe Alexandre, Paquot, you could start if you have some ideas around this. What would be the main goal, or maybe all of them? I don't know.
Thank you. Can I first react to Sabine?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm sorry, maybe I was not cautious enough, but I don't think I have said that we will set targets for removals. What I said is that we need to look at a number of options, and that's one of them. And that's going to be as part of the climate law revision and the revision of the policy framework that we'll have to do before 2026. So I don't want that you go back home by saying, there is this guy from the Commission who is now committed to do what we are dreaming of. So let me just be clear on that. And my second point is I'm fully with you on this question of that carbon removals are complement and not a substitute to emission reduction. That's very clear. It's written everywhere in the 2040 communication, in the industrial carbon management communication. So I think there is no doubt that first needs to come emission reduction. But when I look at also the cost of carbon removals, they're pretty high. So who is going to invest in these expensive technologies without thinking first, what can I do to reduce my emissions? Or the emissions across the value chain. So, okay, I understand your point that we need clarity, but I think we should also be realistic on what is the market going to react, and I think the price signal is extremely important in this field. Then a clarification on what carbon removal certification does and does not do. It sets a very, I would say, robust framework for determining the methodologies for what is carbon removals across the various fields, carbon farming, wood-based products, and the third one is, I need your help, Andrea, permanent removals with BECS and DACs. So that's the purpose, to develop the methodology so that we have at European level a very solid way of measuring these units. It is not about the use of the unit. It is not about the use of the unit. So I understand what you call for. We need clarity, we need a better governance, but don't expect it to be through the CRCF. But there are other tools, and I think the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive gives already a very important framework for how business to business is going to take place around this question of voluntary carbon market and offsetting. And also now we have current discussion in the context of the green claims, so that also we avoid greenwashing when business are communicating to consumers about net zero products, about climate neutral product, and so on. So this is going to help a lot, I think, in terms of clarity on the use side. Okay, this is what I wanted to say, but then I forgot your question.
Yeah, my question was, should the EU deploy some deployment incentives? What would be maybe the priority between, achieving volumes or boosting volumes that can be purchased and generated, bringing prices down, or also leveraging these mechanisms to enshrine good practices on how, to support CDR, which kind of CDR?
Yeah, my gut reaction would be by incentivizing, we will do all of that. We will increase volumes and thereby reduce price and have a better exchange of good practice in the sector. So I wouldn't be too worried about what do we really focus on. But I would like to give you one concrete example of how we try to incentivize this early stage project. And this is this installation in Stockholm. I mean, everybody knows it, the BECS installation. Everybody dreams about it. 800,000 tons of CO2 annually should be, captured and stored from biogenic source. So very good, very nice. And this has been a project selected under the Innovation Fund. So competing with many other type of technologies in the sector meaning industry, clean tech, and so on. So we are going to provide, we have signed with this company a grant agreement of 200 million euros, if I recall well, correct, Andrea? No, you have to correct me, huh?
No, I think it's a little bit more, but I don't know.
It's more, okay, it's even more than that, okay. But it's not covering the whole funding gap. And here, I would like to, really go together with Paolo that we need a better project financing for this type of project, because with the Innovation Fund, we can go up to 60% of the funding gap, but this company still needs to, find the rest to get this, financial close for its project. So they're looking at the carbon, voluntary carbon markets. They're looking at the Swedish authorities. So all of that is pretty complex. So I think by accompanying this project, these big projects, with some really good advice on project financing, I think we can make a difference. At the moment, we still wait for the project to really deliver because they haven't finalized their financial close. And there are also many questions that we have discussing with them about clarity on the regulatory framework. So all of that contributes to make this project really starting on the ground. So it's not as simple as we give money and that's it. It's really accompanying the project to get off the ground.
Thank you. Any other reactions to this question? You want to go in? Yeah.
I just want to react very briefly. Beware if politicians say briefly, it's a monologue of an hour. But very briefly on that question of should we already look at different use cases of CDR versus emissions reductions? And I think Mr. Paquot said something very important. The price, the market price at the moment for CDR is much, much higher than simply reducing your emissions. So if you can, it's in your best interest to reduce emissions for purely financial motives. If a company has no other ulterior motives, at least their balance sheet is normally a very strong indicator what they care about. And so I believe that emissions reductions is something that will happen based on regulations that we have and that will become stronger over the next years. So the question is, should we still wait to develop CDR use cases, or for them to be perfect, for them to be very Puritan? And I strongly believe that we should have started much earlier talking about CDR and actually investing into CDR than wait until the IPCC told us, oh, this is the red light, you really have to go now. And now we are back in a situation where the European continent, a bit like in other tech sectors, is lagging behind. We see the US doing with the IRA stuff that we still only dream about. We see China, India doing stuff where they are actually deploying CDR technologies on the ground, where we in Europe are still debating whether it's the pure way of fighting climate change. I think there is a moment to talk about the theoretical and the philosophical aspects of how do we fight climate change. I think we should get our priorities straight, which is we want to reduce first, but I think the markets are already doing that because it's simply cheaper. But we also need to boost our investment into the technologies that we will need if we want to be a leader in the next 20 or 30 years. This is not tech, this is hard tech. CDR is not something that somebody will build in their garage over a weekend and then deploy on a large scale. They might be building a CDR project for their home use in their garage over the course of a few months, but in the end, it's hard tech. So we need researchers working together with the companies to deploy that on a larger scale. And we see all the issues that the big players in the market have. I was lucky enough to visit Climeworks, and if you look at the pictures and you see them, you think this is a huge farm already present. If you're there, you say, oh, this looks like a big HVAC system. I guess there are bigger HVAC systems than what Climaworks is currently doing. So you have that difference between where we need to be and where we are currently. So we really need to bridge that gap. And so I find the name Carbon Gap quite fitting.
And
Sven,
if I could just add something is, and I think we need to understand also what the dynamic of the CDR market is. It's a futures market. Companies are not buying credits and getting them delivered now to retire them now. They're very much setting up their procurement strategy, building up their CDR streams for them to hit their targets, set by standards that clearly define that they need to reduce their carbon footprint by 90% and remove the rest with permanent removals. And here I'm referring to SBTI. And so the dynamic is very much different. And it's very much what you're saying. Right now, people are funding this to constitute their streams to consistently hit their targets. And there's much to be said, I think, because we've had already a lot of this different conversation. I think some of the elements that are a bit concerning to me, hearing about, for instance, what the European Commission does is already kind of picking winners as well, like doubling down or narrowing the definition of what is an acceptable carbon removal credit with DACs and BECs, when we know that there are growing, open-end systems that could deliver very large quantities of carbon removal credits at very efficient prices, fostering broader market adoptions of these technologies. And also I'd be very cautious about setting in place deployment incentives that are not market-driven, that are artificial, that are not sustained by real private demand. I think there are clearly deployment incentives that can leverage what the private sector is already doing, and I was referring to these funds that provide these bankability guarantees to enable project financing. So it's really important that we keep our focus on what matters, and for us, it's very much enabling project financing. CarbonX's job is to rationalize the procurement of CDRs so that we get these bankable offtakes, and if we can have the guarantees that these are bankable to get infrastructure funds, then fund these projects, then I think we're on the right track. And I don't think if we do adopt such a course, I don't think we'll be at odds with the United States or any other country. I think we have very much our chances, because also today some of the biggest buyers are European. It can be very much our own market. We can define, and I think, what the rules are, and if we do things right, not only can we be independent when it comes to sourcing these credits, but also we can be an exporter of these credits. So that's what I had to say.
Yeah, Sabine, you will have the floor. I just want to mention 3 concepts that I think are floating around you guys as you're talking. So the first one is the like-for-like principle that Carbon Gap has supported quite extensively, and I think that's the underlying assumption of emission reductions happening and the high cost of CDR, avoiding some of the problematic situation. This works as long as the like-for-like principle is enforced and limits the uses of potentially cheap and non-permanent credits for compensating some emissions. I think another one is how you draw a line between residual emissions and other emissions, because that's something we are all struggling with, to precisely draw this border and then have a clear definition on where it is okay to use CDR and where not. And I just wanted also to mention this big debate that has happened over the last months on CRCF and the definition, so that it's inclusive. I think it has improved in the final step, but it's very important indeed, because some of these methods that could deliver important volumes of CDR, permanent CDR, do not need a geologic storage, which is currently a constraint in Europe. So that's where it was so important. Sorry, Sabine, do you want to react?
Okay. I hope somebody of you is going to ask Sylvain about the like-for-like principle and how it helps us. My impression is still it's an offsetting debate. It's a concept that helps us when we discuss residual emissions, but not any emissions that we discuss before we go into this strictly residual emission territory. But this is not what I wanted to, really what I wanted to pick up on. Sven, you are completely right in saying at the moment, removals are so much more expensive than emission reductions or the carbon price for emissions. We don't need to worry about removals replacing emissions. But the strange thing is, they're nevertheless debated in that vein. There's nevertheless a debate about CDR integration into the ETS. And when you look at the debate around the CRCF, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, Monsieur Paquot, I fully understand that it hasn't set out to define uses, that is left for later. But the question was nevertheless in the negotiation space. And what is clear is that the voluntary carbon market, in other words, corporate buyers of CDR units are being eyed up. It's not for nothing, for example, that there isn't an exclusion of that there isn't a provision of corresponding adjustments already being talked about in the CRCF. In other words, an exclusion of double counting and double claiming of CDR units, both by governments, by states, and private purchasers. So that already gives us a foretaste of where the use case is supposed to come from. Side note, also a problem with the CRCF is it certifies units that represent non-permanent storage and have actually no benefit for the climate. We see that as a problematical area. Anyway, yeah, I think I can leave it. I think I can leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Sabine. And maybe one last question before we go to the room. I think we already touched somehow on that, but there is a risk of specialization with some CDR methods developing faster than others, and then suddenly they get more attention and more support, and then there is a risk of specialization. So I would like to ask the panel how deployment incentives could be used precisely to address this and make sure that all viable and safe CDR methods can find the support and scale. Even if, for example, as we mentioned, BECS and DACs, for example, are mentioned all over the place, but there are other methods that also need the support. So, yeah, I know, Sven?
Honestly, I don't think that risk is that big, because just look at private transportation. We were very technology neutral when it came to how the future cars will be driven, as long as they are carbon neutral. And very quickly, it emerged that the most financially viable solution are battery electric vehicles. Period. The market has decided it's hydrogen use in personal transportation is not viable. So the market has moved to the BEV segment. In professional transportation, it's different. So the market has adopted a different technology in the professional transportation sector. And we see the same happening probably in the future in aviation, where currently we talk a lot about SAF, but in the future we'll probably see hybrid forms of aviation. And I think that the risk of us politically forcing one vision is very little if there is a market-driven economy behind it. And we've seen it not quickly enough for the Puritans, but we've seen that coherence emerge in the private transportation sector at least.
Okay, Mr. Paquot?
I think, as you said, Sylvain, the CRCF is broad enough in terms of the methods that could be used for removing carbons from the atmosphere. So yeah, if there is a need to even broaden that, I think the expert group might be a good place for discussing it, but I understand that this is not yet the case.
Paolo, do you want to add?
I think, and here I talk from the private sector's perspective. We're continuously evaluating new CDR removal pathways, new projects, and also it's very topical. Depending on which industry you're in, certain corporates will prioritize certain or specific removal pathways. So what I would try to avoid is, again, kind of enforcing a certain vision, and that's why I really like the bankable fund, because it's on the back of actual market-driven offtakes, which typically will look at a broad range of technologies and identify per topic, per theme, what are the category leaders, what are the most appropriate removal pathways and underlying projects. And with experts, what I'm a bit scared about, these expert groups, is that at the end of the day, there is still a limited group of people, and there can be a lot of interference. And so we've seen that. And so again, I would try to be cautious about these type of approaches. Really look at what the market is doing, look at what CarbonX is doing, No, but independently from that, and back it off.
Can I correct you on the expert group? Because I don't think there is a place that is not more transparent than the expert group that we have set up. How many experts do we have? 72 experts, selected across the whole value chain. It's completely open in terms of its web stream. So the next one is in the 11th of fully. So and
gets a seat at the table.
But you can. If you're not yet on the
You just got an invitation.
I'll invite you on the 15th of April then, and please provide your input. I mean, listening to the debates, provide your input, your knowledge on the sector. I mean, it seems so wide, and I'm really pleased that I'm sitting beside you because I'm learning a lot. Yes, please come in. We need you. We need all the brains because this is such a challenge.
All right, on this very good note, I would like now to open the floor to the room for if you have questions to this panel.
We'll get started with you over there and then move on to you.
Thanks. Meijnerd van der Spek, Research Center for Carbon Solutions at Harvard University. Aaron and I were just debating that we're not on the expert panel, but then we realized that we're not in the EU anymore in the UK, so that must be the reason. But that's not what my question or comment was about. I mean, what you see in the discourse at the moment very much is it's going towards deployment, financing, et cetera, right? And I agree, that's very important, and policy as well. So stable policy, stable outlook for getting your projects funded and financed over a long period. But at the same time, I would argue that there are two other major gaps that I'm not hearing you talk about, and that were actually in the strategy. So I was very happy to see that. But one is capacity building. So everybody in the CDR space is struggling to find skilled people to work, for their organizations. Seeing many familiar faces in the room kind of confirms that. Although I also see some new faces. So that's very good. And the second one is, my proposition is that we don't really know how CDR performs in many cases. And so where governments are indeed working on developing their policies and their strategies, but there's very little, and I say this as a scientist, but there's very little evidence on how different CDR pathways will perform technically, but also economically and environmentally. And I don't hear anybody speak about that anymore. There seems to be a lot of hot money, as one of my Canadian colleagues called it, that is looking for a place to go. It's looking to be invested, either hot government money or hot VC money. But we don't really hear many people talk about what does this mean? What does a gigaton of CDR mean for people and planet, energy use, etc., etc. So I'm hoping to get your feedback on that and bring that into the conversation as well.
Thank you very much. I suggest we take another question and then we go to
then
the
we'll
panel.
forget.
Sorry?
Then we'll forget.
No, you have taken notes, right?
So, I have. Is this on? Okay. So, Paolo, you mentioned the supply kind of coming in response to a path towards demand. And, one way of doing this is, and I imagine kind of the current way that this is being viewed is by setting rules by which supply will be able to access the demand, which comes back to the CRCF. And, if we look into the American context for a moment, the DOE is really having to proactively expand the set of eligible project types that they'd be willing to fund, beyond just geologic sequestration. And they're having to do a very proactive effort into that at the moment. And so I guess one question for the panel would be, kind of, would there be advantages to the CRCF taking a more principles-based kind of methodology approach, and then endorsing private market standards or protocols that meet those in order to, one, be able to move faster to develop these and develop the rules of the road, and then two, enable a greater extent of tech neutrality? Yeah.
Thank you very much. So let's remember the first question, and who wants to go first? Maybe Paolo, you had a reaction you want to start? So the question was
Yeah,
around...
no, capacity building and measuring impact. On the capacity building, I have no specific answer to that. I do agree, although, I mean, I find it that there is a growing stream of people coming in, very talented people. I think it's that are pouring in, and so, but then maybe we should have a CDR supplier amongst the panel to share that. But for me, what I wanted to spend a bit of time on is on the second bit, so kind of measuring the impact of what it actually means to deploy a gigaton. And I think what you're referring to, I mean, the way I interpret this is the need for the market to really develop with a clear stakeholders and their own responsibilities. And there are now private sector stakeholders looking at these impacts. You have private, where you have think tanks, but you also have rating agencies. Part of the work we do is also part of our methodology is assessing these risks and providing them to the corporate buyers we're working with. What I find concerning, however, is that though we're seeing growing number of stakeholders and what we're seeing is the emergence of a functioning market, what I'm really concerned about is, however, I'm seeing a lot of stakeholders playing multiple roles under the same roof, with clear conflict of interests. And I think these are things that we haven't really touched upon, but from a private, it's not only public, it's from a private sector perspective. That's really what also keeps me up at night, because we've seen what happens when we give too much power to a specific entity and how that can impact our market as a whole. And so I think for the CDR market to really be sustainable, we need to be very mindful, and we need to hold the stakeholders accountable for the role they have, and they need to be very clear of what their role is and communicate that openly. And maybe governance here can step in that sense, and I would welcome that.
Thank you. Who wants to react? Sven, do you want to?
Regarding skilled workers, skilled personnel, it's an issue across the block for every tech sector at the moment, so it's not CDR specific. And I think the reply to that is we need to invest into our higher education, we need to invest into upskilling, reskilling of people. I could now give the whole European Commission work program for the next 20 years, and I think it would fit very prominently there. When it comes to the question on should we enlarge or be more technology neutral on what we do, I believe that durability needs to play a role. It doesn't need necessarily to be stored underground, but the question is how durable is the CDR we are doing? And I think the incentive in creating the supply should always be linked to the durability. So I can imagine having the incentives being digressive depending on the durability score. So the less durable you are storing the CO2, the less public money as an incentive you could get, or the less the credit would count towards whatever marketplace we are creating, so that we have an incentive to store it in the very long term. But obviously, I know that academia is working on durability scores and rating systems, so I don't want to go too much into detail. You are way more experts than I am.
Maybe one last reaction, Mr. Paquot, and then it will be time to wrap up.
Just a little bit of publicity again for the CRCF. I think all what you said is very true. I think we need transparency on the durability, on the environmental integrity, and all of that is really at the core of the CRCF. So there are very clear provisions about that. For instance, each unit which will be certified will have a clear indication on the duration, for instance. So I really invite you to join this collective work that we are doing with all of you in this expert group. It's not going to be us in our offices defining the methodologies. It is going to be you. True. I mean, it is just so important that we set these methodologies right, so that we can be really robust and trustful in the way we set up this new market. So please come and help us. And here you have Andrea, who is with me, working in setting all the work around the expert group with others. So please go talk to her, and we'll be happy to continue the journey together.
Thank you. Paolo, 2 seconds.
Because I think maybe it's not clear enough, but I think the CRCF has, however, done so much good. I think it's really moved the needle and has accelerated a lot of the conversation we've had. And I believe a reason why we're going to see, especially in this year, I believe some of the highest or largest volume offtakes take place is very much thanks to the CRCF. So maybe something, I mean, we like to mention what's missing, but I think this has been a very major and significant step towards scaling CDR, especially in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you. So we will end on this very good note. I would like to thank the panel for participating. Maybe we can give them a round of applause. And thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you for participating. It's now time for another coffee break, and then we go into the next sessions. Thank you very much.
We're aware that we kept you a little bit longer, so you get 5 more minutes to your coffee break, but we ask that you move to the panel that you're interested in very quickly after those minutes, please. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rodica Avornic. I'm an Associate Policy Director at Carbon Gap, and I'm super, super privileged to be moderating this panel conversation today on a very, very important topic. But by a show of hands, how many of you were upstairs in the compliance markets panel? Okay, good. And then the rest were downstairs. Another show of hands? Okay, great. So those were the pillars number 2 and number 3 of our vision for a CDR strategy. Now we're going to take a step back to take many steps further. And we're going to discuss how to target EU funding to scale up CDR research, development, and innovation. But before we delve into that topic, I would like to give a big thanks to one of our colleagues who unfortunately is not here today, but I know she's watching us actually online. Eloisa, thank you so much. She's been leading the work on this panel. So a round of applause maybe for our colleague Eloisa Viloria. Thank you. So as you've heard earlier in Sylvain's presentation, at the heart of our discussion today is, funding for research and development and innovation for carbon removal. And in simple words, European and global climate targets will not be met without assembling a diverse portfolio of carbon removal methods that are able to deliver at scale. The issue is that some novel and promising CDR methods, such we can think of enhanced rock weathering, for instance, ocean CDR and so on, are still at an early development stage, and they need targeted research and innovation support to further mature and address pending questions. The EU has already committed to deploying a significant amount of CDR and is among the world's leader in addressing climate change. Yet, its research and innovation funding plans for CDR do not reflect this level of ambition from our perspective. So we've had a look into it, and between 2020 and 2023, the EU directly supported CDR research and innovation with a disbursement of approximately 613 million euro among mechanisms such as Horizon Europe, the Innovation Fund, and the EIC, which is only 0.1% of the EU's budget for the green transition. So this is the setup of our conversation today with our esteemed speakers. So during this session, we'd like to answer 3 big questions. The first one is related to addressing the research gaps. So what research gaps remain to be addressed among carbon removal methods, and what role does research development and innovation funding plays in closing these gaps? The second question is around strategic alignment. So how can we best align the funding support available in the EU to ensure that it is well targeted and coordinated across the different methods, CDR methods? And lastly, financial commitment. How can we manage to expand the budget for carbon removal, research, development, and innovation? I'm sure you have a lot of questions, and there will be an opportunity to engage with our panelists. So there will be a Q&A towards the end of our panel. And there's one more important person in the room that you cannot see on the panel, but that's our rapporteur. That's Lina Nagel from Bellona Europa. She's right here. She's going to be taking note of the conversation, and during the plenary session afterwards, she will deliver the outcomes of this session that will take place now. And I think I've said enough. Now let's go to our panelists. So we'll start with Jeroen Schuppers, a senior expert at DG Research and Innovation at the European Commission. So Jeroen, the European Commission has been supporting carbon capture and storage projects for a while now, but we can also observe now a recent focus on carbon dioxide removal. How has the research and innovation landscape for CDR evolved, and why is this necessary now? Thank you.
Thank you, Rodica. It's interesting to discuss this topic here today. We have indeed quite a long history in CCS, not so much CDR yet, but CCS, and that started about 30 years ago. And I spoke this morning to a colleague from Equinor, the previous Statoil. I think that's where it all started 30 years ago, when they started storing CO2 from their gas field in an aquifer, and that started the first European projects as a satellite around that. Since then, we have seen the emergence of European CCS program, focusing very much on CCS, first of all, in the power sector, coal and gas-fired power plants. That was the idea at the time. Gradually, when we of course saw the renewables taking a fast steps forward, the power industry had more and more options to decarbonize without CCS. So we shifted the attention to the hard-to-abate industries that we heard a lot about already in previous talks. So the cement and the steel and the refineries. And that was reflected in the research program, and we see that now as a success story, I think, reflected in the results of the Innovation Fund, where Alexandre Paquot referred to early this morning in his opening speech. The last call, 2023, of the Innovation Fund has 5 projects in the cement industry that take the full chain from capture to transport to storage. So that is a real success. CDR as a technology has been mainly supported in the past by the Marie Curie actions and the support to SMEs, because these are not the big players like you have in CCS, it's the smaller players, and that's a big difference. But we have seen gradually a cross-fertilization between CDR and CCS, and we saw that already starting in Horizon 2020, when we had a project on Iceland called CarbonX, where they capture CO2 from a geothermal power plant and dissolve it in water and inject it in basalt for a fast mineralization within, let's say, 1 or 2 years. And now they added a CDR module next to this from Climeworks, a Swiss company, a direct air capture unit, and this is scaled up through Horizon Europe, but also now recently in the Innovation Fund, where this is supported as well. So we see this growing. The landscape has changed, and we see that as well reflected in this the recent communication on carbon dioxide removal for industrial carbon management, where this is one of the 3 technologies mentioned. I think what we see, the importance of this is that we are now able to build a pipeline of investable projects by capturing the whole chain from low TRL technology readiness levels towards commercialization, because our challenge is in each part of the chain. And I think this is now, that landscape starts to develop now. Back to you.
Great, thank you so much. A lot of interested thoughts that I will follow up immediately afterwards. But for now, we're going to go to our next speaker. That's Philippe Ciais, Associate Director at the Laboratoire des Sciences du Climat et de l'Environnement. Sorry for my not ideal French. Our question to you to kick off is, could you elaborate a bit on the challenges that the research community is facing when navigating EU procedures for CDR funding, and what improvements could be done as well? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, as a research scientist, I'm more a user of research funding. And well, in short, it's more kind of bottom-up view or intuitive view of the situation rather than a kind of full analytics of the funding which is dedicated to CDR now. But I have the impression, and in short, it's like could do better or even could do much better. Why? Maybe for different reasons. First of all, the volume seems to be very low compared to the stakes. I think the total volume, from what I read from the Carbon Gap website, of dedicated like CDR direct funding is 1%. If you add the indirect effect, like transport of CO2, geological capabilities, you may double this amount. But this is still incredibly small compared to the stakes, because we know that our global budget for remaining below 1.5 degree warming is exhausted virtually. So we want to do 1.5 degree without an overshoot. Say that, okay, overshoot, yes, but overshoot means CDR. I mean, you can't decrease CO2 after a peak if you don't have CDR in play. It's virtually impossible. And honestly, I'm not very optimistic about 1.5 degree, and we are even facing the risk to overpass 2 degree, right? So I think that mainly the funding is highly fragmented. You will find probably a task or work package dealing with CDR in integrated assessment and climate policy cost-benefit scenarios, in Earth system model developments, because we need to understand the Earth system response to CDR technologies, in all kind of agricultural, climate-smart agriculture, and ecosystem-based, nature-based solutions, without speaking of all the kind of technological, green transition and energy projects. So it's so fragmented that I believe that for a decision maker that has funded this project, it's very difficult to get an outcome. Okay, what did we learn across 200 projects about CDR? The supply, the barriers, the offer, the different technologies. So that makes it difficult. Secondly, maybe I found that, at least from my personal experience, that funding is also diluting CDR into things which look like CDR but are not quite like CDR. Like CCS, okay, is basically does nothing to atmospheric CO2. It avoids emission, doesn't reduce CO2, doesn't cool the climate. It just avoids warming. CCU is a kind of reuse of CO2, but in the end, it will kick out CO2 in the atmosphere. And sometimes, you know, these technologies are confused, and CDR task or research is kind of mixed or diluted with those other technologies. Thirdly, maybe because of the fragmentation, I also found that funding on CDR is a kind of broken line between you know, fundamental research about how much CDR do we need to meet a certain climate target, and the on-the-ground work on pilots and technologies. Typically, you know, as a climate researcher, I need a marginal abatement of cost curve for a range of technologies. You know, I find them from the literature, but I guess, you know, my own cost abatement assessment are completely disconnected from practitioners working on CDR on the ground. And I feel that we need to bridge this gap to make things happen. So that would be my, you know, few words about kind of, you know, intuitive vision of the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philippe. We'll go next to Lee Beck, Senior Director, Europe and Middle East at the Clean Air Task Force. So, Lee, there is a need of alignment between research development and innovation and deployment of CDR technologies and methods. How can that be reflected in EU funding?
Yeah, thanks, Rodica, for having me on this panel. Thanks to Carbon Gap, and congratulations for launching this incredible report, which I think provides a lot of clarity on a strategic policy approach for scaling CDR. So I just wanted to congratulate everyone at Carbon Gap for this. For those of you who don't know, Clean Air Task Force, we're a global climate organization focusing on technology optionality, so bringing as many options, technology options, climate mitigation, and CDR options to scale as possible across the globe. And so we work on a range of technologies, not just CDR. In Europe, we've been focusing on the CRCF, of course, together with other NGOs, including Carbon Gap. We've also worked on the industrial carbon management strategy and ensured that carbon removal is appropriately represented there, alongside a range of collaborations. And I think recently we took a step back because at Clean Air Task Force we're really interested to understand how have we scaled technologies in the past, or options/solutions, and what can we learn from these approaches so we don't necessarily repeat the same patterns but actually apply, as we're going through new policy formulation, those lessons. And so I want to take a step back and really think about, okay, when we're scaling options or solutions/technologies, we really are going through a process. We need to reduce costs, we need to enable financing, we need to have repeated projects, not just 200 times the first of a kind and then nothing. We need to create ecosystem conditions, so have the space, the infrastructure necessarily for direct air capture, for example, 24/7, 365 of clean electricity. But it's really, as we're thinking through, as technologies kind of they're conceptualized and they are deployed, and then they kind of, mature and plateau as they scale. So the role of R&D is not just in the beginning, and that's what we've often gotten wrong, or governments have often gotten wrong. They think of R&D as this thing that happens in the beginning, and then kind of it trickles out. It is important in the beginning, but it's important to have continuous R&D to ensure that we're reducing costs, we're innovating process, we're mining efficiencies, we're understanding. It's hugely important as an input to planning where we should be even doing which solutions from an efficiency, because Europe is highly land dense. And so one of our forthcoming reports looks at AMPS. This is an interesting acronym. talk to Cody more, who's here in the front row, about it, but it's additionality, measurement, permanence, and scalability. And R&D should look at all of these because all of these have tensions and different tensions for different solutions. So for DAC, costs inhibits scalability, but R&D can help us understand how we can reduce costs. For example, let's take enhanced rock weathering, then you're really looking at the measurability and the permanence questions. So it's really important that we're looking at R&D and formulating R&D policy in a way that actually thinks through how can we most efficiently scale these options and solutions. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. I'll stop here, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee, and we're looking forward to read the report, Cody. I'll talk to you about it. Last but not least, Megan Kemp, head of tech carbon dioxide removals at South Pole. The question would be around the role of the private sector in all this, and how can the EU mobilize the private sector and the private sector funding to help scale up CDR?
Wicked, thank you. And thanks very much for having me. So I think the role of the private sector really needs to be considered in what do we need to do at speed. That's something the private sector can do, especially facilitated by the EU, quicker than maybe member states can move. So in the next 5 years, we need to create a framework or create the conditions for a commodities market, enough volume of high durability removals. And so we need to act now to create a portfolio approach, as we've spoken about before. We need to migrate from that small level companies acting on the voluntary carbon market to at scale businesses. And this really speaks to what you were saying, Lee, about R&D through that process. And then we need to bridge between what's the voluntary carbon market doing now and how are the credits that are going to be bought today, how will they be used on a market like the ETS or a specific removals program? And so this is where you really need the private sector, thinking about the speed and the scale. And I think let's look at the gap in funding, right? You mentioned, Rodica, that 613 million has been paid to date, looking around 3 to 6 billion that's needed over the next 15 years. This is not going to come yet, even if we get funding from the New Horizon Europe. That's not coming in until 2027. And then EU member states often don't have the fundamental ability to access that funding now or to set frameworks without the EU's action. So how can the EU actually act to move this capital from private sector? I think they can do a few things. Like, what does the private sector need? It needs clarity, and I think Paolo, who's not in the room, he was talking about this a lot on our last panel, and reduce risk. So clarity can come from the CRCF, it can come from an EU strategy, and moves are starting to be made there, and certainly as we talk to private sector actors all the time. I work for South Pole, but our major move in the removals market is NextGen, which is an advanced buyers facility. So we think about buyers all the time and what they need. They're trying to invest in the market now. They're very confused. They can't see where are we aiming for and what are we trying to do. So that clarity, and then de-risking initiatives. And this is really around how can the EU facilitate public-private partnerships. And a big thing that the EU already does is the business platform. So we've seen that announced on the European Battery Alliance. We've seen that announced as part of the hydrogen strategy. How can you simplify access to funding, which would especially speak to your points, Philippe, and then also de-risk that initial funding, so create a sort of first loss capital position. And then where the private sector can have a lot of impact on beyond that initial R&D and into scaling is through the EU leading on some sort of procurement pilot. So look at what the US is doing. With only 35 million, they're able to take this leadership position. They've already just been matched by Google. You're able to move the private sector for a relatively small amount of money. And that's a really clear signal and a really clear demand signal that we can use then to test for companies to test scaling and to test that scale-up technology that we need.
Thank you. Couldn't have said it better ourselves. I'll go back to Jeroen for now. Questions around we touched upon that, but what are the concrete EU funding opportunities for CDR that are available at the moment? And I mean, we've heard that maybe they're not like the full amount that we would need, not sufficient. So what other options could be envisioned? And do you have any reactions to what was said by the other colleagues now? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Shirley. We have, of course, our main instrument for us is Horizon Europe, which has a limited budget as you compare to an innovation fund, but nevertheless we support the CDR through the current calls that we have. We have the call in 2024 open, so it opens this year, with a topic on direct air capture and bioenergy CCS. We have supported this in different parts of the Horizon Europe as well, in the climate parts, where there's more generic studies on the implications of carbon dioxide removal. But this is a topic that I mentioned on DAX and BECS that we support through the energy program. This is where I come from. And of course, we have the Innovation Fund, which has a much larger budget. As mentioned this morning, it's about 40 billion euros. Depends on the CO2 price, obviously, which is going down a bit now. But and that is another one. Then we have a program which is called EU Breakthrough Catalyst, which is much less well known, where we put Horizon Europe money with Innovation Fund money and the EIB together with global philanthropic organizations, the Bill Gates Foundation, to get like $1 billion together in 4 technologies, 5 at the moment. One of them is CDR. The difficulty is there that this program requires a cash flow within a few years back, which is difficult for CDR, obviously. How can we improve? I think one thing to improve is what we're already trying to do is to provide more synergies between the different programs and different steps, because there is a gap between Horizon Europe and Innovation Fund. What we try to do is make sure that projects that we fund on Horizon Europe, in their outputs, have the same, let's say, the qualities that will allow them to apply for the Innovation Fund. For example, in terms of greenhouse gas calculation methodologies, for example. Another thing I think we should what I could mention is how can we do better? We cannot increase funding so easily. The member states have just decided to decrease Horizon Europe budgets, so I mean it goes in the wrong direction. But having targets, having a strategy, having clarity, as was mentioned, is important for every technology. We had it for renewables. This is why renewables have a high budget and easily defendable. For CCS, it's already much more under pressure, of course, but there we have some targets as well. So for CDR, having targets could help.
Thank you very much. Philippe, we've been talking a little bit about research gaps. From your perspective, what are the research gaps that remain to be addressed among carbon removal methods, and what role does, of course, funding can play in that? And if you could give some examples, that would be great as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, well, some of the research gaps relate to kind of emerging CDR technologies like enhanced weathering, biochars, which have not been really included in any serious climate mitigation scenarios. So they are kind of, people work on them, but there is very little or insufficient knowledge to incorporate them at scale in, regional or global mitigation scenario. Another gap that I see is perhaps the fact that, we produce a huge amount of knowledge and literature, which is fragmented in a lot of scientific peer-reviewed publications, and it's impossible for decision makers, any normal human beings, to have a clear view of the research outcome. And in a sense, for the climate research, we have the IPCC, and the IPCC is producing a huge synthesis report that provides a summary for policymakers that convince, essentially the essential messages that need to be taken into account. And I feel that we kind of miss this kind of integrative research, which can be based on methods which are well recognized, like in medical research, like meta-analysis. Data mining is a powerful way to assess the efficiency of medical treatment. And I believe those kind of, integrative data mining, meta-analysis methods are very useful also to better compare different CDR technologies and their possible future pathways. So that would be my take on the research gaps. Lack of, let's say, high-level dialogue between the scientific community and decision makers who are going to implement or set targets. Lack of focused research on emerging CDR technologies in a changing world. And also maybe lack of a systematic, integration and analysis of existing data. And well, when the EU wants something, it can have a good instrument to do it. Like I was involved a couple of years ago into a carbon monitoring strategy, and in a few years I was very impressed because the EU created a task force between different DGs, and it brought up the European Space Agency, the European Centre for Middle-Range Weather Forecast, the scientific community, the GRC, all the important bodies. They created a task force, and now they're going to launch, 3 or 4 satellites for, it's about €500 million program, and have an operational system to monitor greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And that was, happening from scratch to a real program that is part of the Copernicus program in 2 to 3 years. And I would like to see, such a kind of phase transition happen also in the CDR domain.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Megan, you did mention a little bit the situation at the global level. So I'd have a follow-up. How would the current level of EU funding for CDR in Europe compare to the estimated global funding requirements over the next 2 decades? And what are the potential consequences of such a disparity?
Let me answer that in 1 second. I just want to add a tiny bit to the research point. I think as well as all the very clear tech gaps and thinking about tech on a global scale and meta-analysis, I think there's also a real gap on actually how to govern this, what policy is needed, how to govern on a global scale. The strategy vies away, or your mention of the strategy vies away from anything to do with how do we think about international credits, how are we going to engage with different organizations from different countries on this, are we going to buy international credits, how would you possibly manage that system? I think we need to do a lot of research there, and one way that we can do that is through trial and error and testing in member states under a very clear framework that the strategy would provide, that CRCF begins to provide. So I think we can't forget that side. Thinking about the gap, so yeah, there's a huge gap between what's being spent now. To your point, the reduction in Horizon Europe is worrying. And I think, what does it mean? I mean, at the absolute most catastrophic level, it means that if the European Union don't take a lead and don't fund removals now, we'll completely overshoot our climate goals. At a less catastrophic level, it means that other countries and other groups of countries will step up. Like we've seen the US do that now. I think that works. You need lots of countries. There's a big role for the US to play as well as the European Union. But without developing an actual robust market that has policy and funding and speedy deployment, I think it's going to be hard to see the European Union take then a leadership role on the regulatory side, on the certification side. And so we're going to have a lot less control on what is being sold and bought as carbon removals and what a high durability removal actually means, which I don't think we want to lose.
Thank you. Maybe one last question, then we open the floor to the audience. And it's something that was mentioned a little bit and leads to you. But also, please, all the other panelists, feel free to contribute as well. The situation at member state level, and how can member states enhance their commitments to CDR, both independently and in collaboration with the EU, to make sure that we accelerate the development and deployment of CDR at scale? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I just want to say that I think, again, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, right? I think my favorite anecdote is when the US passed the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of European countries and the EU, it's like, whoa, that's so much money. But is it really, if you're pulling together everything that the European member states and the EU spends on renewables, actually it was pretty close. What was really going on is that there was no overview of who's funding what in terms of infrastructure. There was lack of coordination. There's a big Burwell paper that was released about a year ago that I thought was very insightful for this. And actually, Clean Air Task Force, we went on a kind of chase to categorize all the different funding mechanisms on the member state and EU level for different advanced energy tech. And our consultant threw their hands in the air and said, you know what, actually we can't do this. The languages, the differences in kind of funding, all of this is too complicated to actually give you a full and appropriate and accurate picture. So I think as we're getting started with CDR now, right, this is why this strategy that you're proposing and agenda setting is so important, because it needs to be streamlined so we're really most efficiently using every single dollar across European Union and member states and creating a kaleidoscope of different diverse policies that have the end goal in mind. And I think that's really right. You can have research funding, you can have prizes, you can have grants, you can have ecosystem. All, as Lena likes to say, all member states have emissions, but not everyone has CO2 storage or enough land or enough electricity or enough ecosystem conditions to make CDR work everywhere. So it's really as a feed-in mechanism to planning across the union. I think R&D in a coordinated and strategic way is really, really important. So this would be my ask to the European Commission, but also to member state governments, is really talk to your fellow governments, try to align, try to coordinate, and we as NGOs, as think tanks in the private sector, I'm sure as well, are here to support you with that. So I'll leave it at this, but I think this is my hope.
Thank you for that call to action. And now it's your turn. So we'll start with 3 questions. I hope there are 3 questions in the audience. Please raise your hand, and my colleague, I have somebody in the back. Somebody, yes, perfect. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Achim Hoffman. I'm a startup founder, MCDR, in the UK. My question is, you might be biased on that answer. I'm considering moving my venture to Germany because of Brexit and all the other problems, and the Inflation Reduction Act on the one side and the Europe on the other. So is there a pitch you can make to me to come over? Sorry, but then my second question is, in my previous life, before I did what I'm doing now, I was a venture capital investor, early stage investment into university spin-outs in the UK. Horizon was always horrific. I was building hard tech companies from the universities, pre-seed, seed, round A, and I think the earliest we could really consider Horizon was like round B, round C, because then there was a team big enough in place to handle all the commitments connected to this. And also the timelines, obviously, were usually like 4 or 5 years, 6 years, you have to plan in advance. And as a pre-seed seed company, you're just in no position to think that far ahead. Your investors will not allow you to do that. Well, I did not allow my companies to do that. So I was just wondering, is there any movement happening on the European level to cut down timelines? Time in the past didn't really have a lot of value, but, time in the past didn't have a lot of value. Now with climate, time has value.
Absolutely, thank you so much. To anyone in particular, is this question addressed, or to all the panelists? Sir?
Oh, sorry.
Is it a question to somebody in particular?
Well,
everyone?
no.
Okay, fine. There was another question in the back. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it works. Yeah, my name is Peter Freeman, Taxila Capital. We specialize in advising in strategy and funding tech companies in TRL 4 to 6, usually where nobody's there, we are there. And I am in the process of associating with an ocean-based CDR company out of the States, out of my alma mater, UCLA, that would like to come to Europe. We have pilots running in the States and in Singapore. And I would like to know what is the pathway, what do we have to do, or what do we have to do to access European funding? I have an idea that we set up shop in Luxembourg. rather than in Germany or France, because of makes it easier. But then I would like to know from Jeroen how can we get into the European funding programs? The capital behind my future client is consequential, but we need to set up shop in Europe. That's one thing I would like to know. The second thing is just a devil's seed I would like to place in everybody's mind, and that is, I hear we talk about funding gaps in certain strategies, but we need 130 trillion euros to get to Glasgow net finance in 2050. We're about at 100 trillion world GDP today. We need to grow by 3% compound annual growth for the next 25 years to just get those $130 trillion. We haven't paid for defense, which Putin likes to hear, that we haven't paid for defense. We haven't paid for healthcare, right? So we need to take it out of capital stock. Now, capital stock is certainly more than 200, 300, 400, 600 trillion dollars. But over the last 10 years, it's been asset inflation. Most is bound in real estate. So we just don't have enough money to get to net zero. And when I have this discussion behind closed doors with very senior people, they all agree. But if you say publicly, then of course it's a bit of a depressive scenario. And I think the only way out of this is that we have purchase program-based funding, which doesn't care about whether you're in TRL 4 to 6, because the private capital that gets into TRL past 6, when it is scaled up, it's de-risked, that's easy. I come from this world, it's easy, right? The capital that goes into TRL 1 to 4, that's easy as well because it's university money, so if it goes down the drain, we don't feel it. So I think the only way that we can fund the difficult decisions that we have to make for TRLs 4 to 6 is through purchase programs that, for instance, generation of my son, 18-year-old, decides to buy a service or product that is associated with a certain purchase program, and this is how we can fund that.
Thank you, sir. And a third question, and then we will come back. I think there's somebody here towards the center. Thank you.
2 quick ones?
Sure.
Okay.
Promise they're quick.
Yeah. My name is Julius. I'm with a German biochar carbon removal company. And since, from what I'm seeing, Horizon and all the funding programs are mainly focused on CCS-based CDR technologies, how we can make sure to have it more tech neutral.
I think mine's quite linked actually to Julius's question, probably directed to Philippe. I have just a question about practical implementation and technology agnosticity. Just in terms of implementation of methodologies and rollout for the CRCF, what we're seeing is, even though there will be a plan laid out with a time frame for working out protocols for each tech area, we already have clients who are ahead of the game and only will really want CRCF accredited credits in the early days. They're going to wait for those. So we're seeing a de facto challenge with technology agnosticity, just given the sort of sheer timing. So I think linked to Julius's, really quick follow-up one, sorry. Just around soil carbon. I used to work in soil carbon, and one of the major challenges around MRV was the sheer cost to landowners and farmers to actually carry out that monitoring. In the UK, we're working on different methods, perhaps, to drive pace in soil carbon. So are you so fixed necessarily on the MRV, or do you have to look at action and activity-led financing as well? So just 2 from me.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
We'll stop for now. If we have more time, we're going to go back to the audience. Maybe we'll start with Jeroen. Quite a lot of questions there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think funding is very popular here. The first question, if I understood right, how can we speed up and the difficulty of red tape? I think for Horizon Europe, we work, of course, with coalitions of partners in a project. So by nature, if you have 10 partners or more, that takes time to get a grant agreement together, as we call it. But we have outsourced everything to an agency, which gives a lot more specialization and focus to the whole process. So the time to grant, as we call it, has decreased over the years already. But there is not more that I can do or that we can do from that perspective so much. On the issue of the pre-seed to seed, the difficulty of the process. Horizon Europe may not be the best program. Then we also have the Innovation Council, which is structured in a way where you can go for single researcher from the pathfinder to the transition to the accelerator. So it's not working with large consortia. It's much more geared towards SMEs. So that may be a better program. On the second question, if I understood well, it came back to how can we, for US-based companies, access European funding. Now, this is, of course, logically not always possible. I mean, it's open to the world. Horizon Europe is open to the world, with a few exceptions here and there for China. But for industrialized countries, it's clear they have to bring their own money, because we're not going to pay in principle for the US partners unless they are absolutely necessary in a program, which is not always the case. So just having access to European funding, difficult through Horizon Europe. That's all I can say.
Thank you. I think, Lee, you wanted to react to that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I want to comment on two issues. Thank you so much for the comment on capital constraints and what the transition is expected to cost. I think a lot of times people throw out the IEA number, $3 trillion a year, which is only double, twice as much, but actually it's going to be much more expensive. And this brings me back to R&D, because I think this geopolitically induced notion of industrial policy that every country has, or every, within the EU, of course, the EU has to be the leader on everything. That's not going to work out. We have to work with our allies, for lack of a better word, on understanding where do we actually have a competitive advantage in some technologies, and what supply chains can we source from whom in the most efficient, most cost-beneficial way. As we said earlier, not every CDR option is going to work everywhere, and there might be huge cost differentials if you really plan and think through what works the best way, including the cost of electricity, land, and so on. And so I just want to caution that we actually should be using R&D money to understand those conditions, those ecosystem conditions, very judiciously, to then plan and systematically deploy CDR. So we're achieving it at a systems cost that is lowest, because the transition is going to be so expensive. The other piece, the other question was about MRV first. I think if we really want to make sure that the CDR sector has the credibility that it needs to be considered a long-term solution, we want to be very, very careful of MRV, and that's why we think the CRCF actually is the most important first step to complement voluntary markets and to set a standard of what really qualifies as a removal, because otherwise it will just end up in a hype cycle. And then we'll lose credibility, not just in the market, but also from the public. And that's the worst thing I think we can all agree here that we want to happen for climate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lee. Any other reactions to those questions? Maybe Philippe or Megan? Yep.
I don't know. You have to talk to me baby language, because you mentioned some like CRCF. Sorry, if you don't explain me what this is, I will take even a stronger French accent. What is it?
So it's the carbon removal certification framework.
Ah, okay. Yep. It's a kind of carbon crediting. Yeah. Yeah, I can understand that, of course, MRV for ocean and land removal, soil carbon is quite critical. It's also critical and even criticized for forest carbon projects. I think I insist also on the importance of the M in MRV because a lot of land-based CDR technologies have potential problems with non-permanence, like you have a disturbance event, fire, storms, whatever happens, tillage for soil carbon, and you may lose all the carbon you have patiently gained before. So having something that can monitor over time, the evolution of carbon as an asset in the land or the ocean is particularly important. because a lot of insurance systems are based on this. Huh? Like you make a project and then you take a provision for possible losses, like 5, 10%, whatever. But we need to consider that the risk due to climate change is not stationary. So you can make a provision with a 5% carbon loss when you plant a forest, but maybe, you know, in 20 years, the climate risk will make it 10 or 20%. So that's very important to include in the CDR, you know, MRV system, the kind of climate increased exposure of carbon assets.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can take one more question from the audience. I don't know if there's, yes, please. My colleague will be there with you in a second.
Thank you. Jan-Philip Wassenaar from Nature Credits. On the MRV side of things, there's thousands of projects of people that are doing carbon removal projects. They all have these big PDFs in a cupboard. And one of the problems we have is you don't really have the access to that data. So there's a lot of new technology coming up, eDNA, remote sensing, and all these kind of things, but you have no data to calibrate that stuff. Do you see maybe something for the EU, or create a European data warehouse for CDR measurements? So at least you can, R&D will have access to data.
Thank you very much. Anyone with a reaction to this? Yeah, please.
I think that's an excellent idea that you should probably think about in this as your agenda setting the CDR strategy. But R&D, again, important for those technologies, making them as efficient and as impactful, and of course, creating those data sets. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have more time for questions, so we'll move to concluding remarks. And here, the floor is back to you, our esteemed speakers. What would be the main thing that you would like people in this room to go home with thinking about? And it can be funding related, it can be beyond funding, anything CDR related. If it would be one thing, what would it be? And maybe we can start with you, Jeroen, indeed.
For me, the message would be that the bottom line for everything that we do is that it will require enormous amounts of renewable energy. So that is, for me, the bottom line. We need more renewable energy, and this should be on top of the list, and that's part of the Green Deal as well.
Thank you.
I think the key things, if I'm thinking about an EU strategy, what do we really desperately need? It's a very clear vision. It's targets that are set out and adjusted as we reduce so that we're not over amplifying the need for removals. It's a easy and accessible way for the private sector to play in the same schools, especially at this early stage in the market, as removals, as the public sector, and a very clear bridge, a clear roadmap from today, small scale VCM action, to large scale commodity use market. How is it actually going to work? And then let the market choose the technologies. Make sure you invest across a wide range of methodologies, but the market will choose and should be market run.
Thank you.
Yeah, from this panel, I would say R&D isn't just the beginning, but in general, I think, ensuring that we're thinking about the ecosystem, that we're still prioritizing mitigation as soon as possible, because that's what it's really about. The sooner we can reduce emissions, the better our chance at fending off the worst effect of climate change. And then also, I think in general as a community, being really judicious about not feeding a hype cycle, but being honest about the scalability, about the limitations and advantages of some solutions over others. I think that's what I would like to see.
Thank you, Lee.
Yeah, I regret not to have been in the session upstairs, because my main message is that somehow we know that we will only solve the global climate crisis globally by talking to large emitters like China, India, and so on. And those countries will only do mitigation at scale together with other countries if it helps them to raise the income of people and alleviate poverty. So I would like to think about how CDR can be part of a new thread between the North and the South dialogue, which is so tense at the moment, because a lot of CDR opportunities lie in the global South, in particular related to land-based and maybe ocean-based opportunities.
Thank you so much, and that was a brilliant link made to the panel that is happening now upstairs on the justice-centered approach to CDR. You're here, but it will be online for you to follow after the event. I really encourage you to follow that because it's an important pillar of our strategy as well. And my colleague Kayla has done a tremendous job in developing that part. Thank you so much again. A round of applause for our speakers. Thank you, and thank you to you here in the room. I hope you're inspired, more inspired. If there's one conclusion, is that there should be more funding for CDR. We can all agree on that. Yeah, we have a 5-minute break, more or less, and then we will invite you back here to the plenary session, where we'll have a special message, and then the rapporteurs will deliver the outcomes of our conference today. See you in a bit.
Thank you, everyone, for all of the great discussion. I know there is never enough time to talk, but we would like to ask you to kindly please come back to the main room, grab a seat. I believe the room will be full, so you need to snatch your seat as quickly as possible. If you could please make your way towards the front of the room, that would be great. Can we have everyone back in the main room, please? We are going to get started shortly. We are all meeting back in the main room. Please grab a seat. Please make your way to the main room. We are about to get started. Can I get everyone back in the room, please? Yes. In the plenary. Yes. Thank you very much. Activist to give a keynote speech to us and open what will be the final discussions of this event. He provided his perspective on what activism means to him, what it means to bring your values into your daily life, and how do you deal with potential obstacles and overcoming them. Kumi Naidoo is not just a human rights activist. You will see in his description on the screen that he was Director General at Amnesty and Greenpeace International. He started his activism work when he was 15 during the apartheid in South Africa. We hope his keynote inspires you, and we are happy to get you in touch with him, or at least with us, if you would like to carry on this conversation that is a little bit out of what we've been talking about for now, because we also think it's important to reflect on how you feel when you're trying to change the world at your own scale. Let's move on to the video.
Dear friends and colleagues, thank you for your kind invitation to offer some opening reflections to your important conference. I must confess that these days I'm much more nervous than I was as a 15-year-old activist fighting against the apartheid system. And the reason for that is best captured in this story. Speaking to an audience in the United States a couple of years ago and reflecting on the state of the world, during the Q&A time, a very upset delegate put up a hand and said, "Mr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" And I said, "Yes, I did. He inspired me and many other people in my home country, South Africa, in our fight for justice." And she said, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" Thinking it was a trick question, I very gently said, "I have a dream." And she shouted back at me saying, "Yes, it was I have a dream, but when you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare. The forests are disappearing, the oceans are rising, inequalities on the rise, emissions are shooting up, and so on." Herein lies a key challenge of the moment that we find ourselves in. We have to be able to speak truth to power, to analyze the deep crisis that we find ourselves in, and also the fact that we have a convergence of multiple crises, not just climate, but rising fascism, deepening inequality, conflict, and so on. And how do we do that on the one hand that is honest, but doesn't demobilize, demotivate, and create a sense of despair and depression where people feel there's no purpose of actually trying to make a difference? So I want to start this message by saying that the moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And that the pessimism that might emerge from our analysis, our observations, and our lived experiences can best be overcome by the optimism of our thought, our creativity, and our courage. When I was the head of Greenpeace International in July of 2015, I spent some time in the Pacific, in Vanuatu, Fiji, and in Kiribati, pronounced Kiribati. And I learned a very painful slogan while I was there. People in July of 2015 were chanting the slogan, 1.5 to stay alive. 1.5 to stay alive. 6 months later, at the Paris climate negotiations, I meet the same new friends of mine from the Pacific, and they asked me to come and address a meeting just outside of the negotiating chamber that they got permission for. So I joined them and I think, oh, let me respect what I learned from them, and I'm about to start chanting 1.5 to stay alive. And they say, no, the slogan has changed. And the new slogan is 1.5, we might survive. That was a very chilling experience for me, and one that should move all of us. But sadly, for far too long now, we have not had the kind of response that was critically needed. And we have ignored the most powerful nations in the world, those often, most of them, who play the biggest role in driving up emissions and so on, their corporations as well as the governments paid lip service to the actions that we needed to take. Let's be very clear. We cannot change the science. All we can change is political will. And thankfully, political will is a renewable resource. As we reflect in the moment that we find ourselves in, we have to recognize that while we are winning many significant battles in our fight to averse catastrophic, runaway, irreversible climate change, we are patently losing the overall war. And one of the reasons we must accept now why we are losing is that those of us who are in the movement to promote climate action, whether you come from government, business, or in civil society, we are part of the problem. Because we talk a language that is inaccessible to the vast majority of people. We aim most of our narratives at the head and the brain, where we are talking about science, targets, policies, proposals, and so on, often in a language that is alienating and excluding of the vast majority of people in the world, including those who might have had a benefit of a university education. What we have failed to do is what Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and the ilk do, which is they ignore the brain and they shoot everything at the heart and try to move people through weaponizing hate of various kinds. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should deviate from the facts, but we have to be able to present the facts in a way that is much more moving, much more creative, much less boring. That is the challenge that we absolutely face today in the overall climate justice movement globally. Also, because activism starts often from a point of how people are excluded, marginalized, oppressed, repressed, and so on, one of the mistakes we appear to be making unwittingly is that we imagine, therefore, that because people have been through so much historically, from colonialism to slavery to the various other injustices that people have had to face, that we think that people are having less agency than they do in reality have. So part of what we need to do is to conceptualize of multiple different ways in which we think of ways in which people can participate. And it's critically important that we recognize that the scale of the challenge that we face in shifting public opinion will require the biggest ever mobilization of people that we've ever seen on the planet with the greatest level of urgency. And part of how we do that is also about recognizing that we need to pick up ideas such as artivism, where we bring arts, culture, and activism together to move people with sufficient urgency and with a sufficient sense of you have to be part of the solution. I want to now turn to the topic of your conference, carbon dioxide removal. The first thing we must acknowledge, the very fact that we're having this conversation about the need to embrace carbon dioxide removal is a recognition of failure. Had we acted in 1992 or shortly thereafter, after the first Rio Earth Summit, we would not be in the crisis that we are in. We have incremental baby steps in the right direction periodically, and then we have quite a lot of one step forward, two step backwards when new challenges emerge, such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it seemed to us in the global south that the commitments that Europe had made on climate suddenly became very, very negotiable and very, very compromisable. This is not good enough. And therefore, when I think about the people in the Pacific Island states, for example, and other least developed countries and island states in general, I am tortured by the fact that we have let those communities down. That in fact, right now, without considering carbon dioxide removal as a serious part of our strategy, we do not have a chance to save and secure the future of people in the most vulnerable places around the world. Now, let me just say, for many people within the climate justice movement, we have considered many of these initiatives, which started, of course, with carbon capture and storage and so on, as moral hazards. That if this was put on the table, it will discourage the fast withdrawal from our addiction to fossil fuels. So therefore, with much trepidation before the COP in Egypt, I penned an editorial on Al Jazeera's website saying, whether we like it or not, we have to now consider responsible, science-led carbon dioxide removal strategies. I want to share with you what response I got to that, particularly from the people I've worked with and people who I love and respect, who are in the front lines of action against climate change on a day-to-day basis, sometimes putting their lives at risk and sometimes losing their lives. It was one of the most painful discussions I've had in my entire life. There were mainly folks from the Global South and a few folks from the North who requested the meeting, and of course I made time to register in no uncertain terms with me how unhappy they were that I had taken that position. Their concerns were, yes, for example, they would say, correctly so, that if we build algae sea forests, for example, in the ocean to draw carbon dioxide, that might appear on the surface to be unproblematic, but what does that mean for other changes that we might see in the ocean and the marine life more generally? There is a deep concern that we will have to engage in interventions that will risk further damage without the science verifying whether a particular strategy is actually appropriate and so on. For me, the two reasons why I felt we have to do this and engage with it in as responsible and a people-centric way as possible. One is the fact that whether people in the Global South, like myself, like it or not, sadly, this train has left the station. Hundreds of millions of dollars globally now are already being invested by private companies as well as governments in exploring this area. So long as it's happening, my view was we have to get on top of it and try to make it as just, fair, science-led, and so on. The second is, sadly, I have to concede that there is no pathway for the people of the Pacific Island states and other most vulnerable countries right now, given that we are pushing on the 1.5 degree target that we were supposed to stay under. So yes, we need to do everything to stay under that target or be as close to it as possible and do that which is needed as the primary strategy, which is carbon emissions. But even if we did all of that, the reality is the carbon is in the atmosphere. Even if tomorrow we switched off all emissions, we are still in deep trouble because, as you well know, the carbon dioxide remains in our atmosphere. So therefore, I conclude by saying that we also should hear the concerns that if there's going to be large-scale projects to do this, it would potentially be sited in the Global South. And the Global South, yet again, will be exploited and be used as a guinea pig for some of these. These were some of the issues that my colleagues raised with me. And it was with great sadness I ended that meeting, recognizing the pain, recognizing the risk that this could send a signal to some quarters that, hey, maybe we need to slow down on emissions reduction. I hope that's not the case. I argued that I believe that train has left the station and we've won the argument and so on. However, Europe's own performance following the Ukraine invasion by Russia does raise questions about how easy it is to go back to old ways of being. So I appeal to you in your deliberations today to ensure that, one, any carbon dioxide removal strategy should be science-led, should be governed by an inclusive global governance arrangement. The best I can see at the moment, in the absence of other options, is perhaps the IPCC can be asked to review any technologies and so on that are being proposed to ensure that it doesn't take down carbon on the one hand, but create some other catastrophe on the other. And third, we need to ensure that the voices of the Global South, who are marginalized from this global conversation at the moment, are centrally included. We also have to clarify how is carbon dioxide removal different from carbon capture and storage, which made exaggerated claims about its efficacy when it was first talked about and delivered very, very little. So I also urge you not to get to a situation where we are making exaggerated claims about what CDR can offer without making sure that we can verify in very specific target-related ways that we can actually achieve that. I want to conclude by wishing you a wonderful conference, a productive conference, and one that will lead us to a world where carbon dioxide removal is done in a just, equitable, sustainable, and inclusive manner, and one in which people, particularly from the Global South, are made to be a central part of the solution, and to do that in ways that frontline communities are engaged in very serious, real, and respectful ways. Muchas gracias, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for allowing me to offer these comments.
At least sparked some reflections within you. We hope you take them with you to your circles, and this keynote speech will be made available on our YouTube channel as soon as it's available for us. And I now ask the four rapporteurs from our panels to please join me to the stage. They will be delivering key conclusions and remarks from the panels that they are reporting on. We will get started with Lina from Bologna Europe, then carrying on to Chris from Negative Emissions Platform, Sam from Carbon Market Watch, and finally with Rachel from Oxford Net Zero. Lina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming today, and of course for having us from Bologna as well. I'll try to keep it relatively short. I know we're running a bit over time. So I am the rapporteur for the panel looking into funding. And I think it was pretty clear already from the first Slido that funding here is very crucial. It's one of the issues or areas that I think most of us are looking into. What I find interesting also when we talk about funding, and which the panel also reflected, is the different ways in which we look at this concept we call funding. Because of course we talk about public funding opportunities, public funding mechanisms, but we also talk about mobilizing private capital and the need for a regulatory approach that reduces, for example, uncertainties. Here, of course, this strategy. And I think we could see that also on the Slido. Some people were mentioning a business case. Some people were talking about Horizon money. So there's lots of different things here. And I think it's crucial that we keep that in mind when we are looking into the topic. Because in fact, when we are looking into especially research, into also R&D, when we look into deployment as well, we have to remember that this is not necessarily an area where there is one-size-fits-all approach. And one of the things that was mentioned in particular was that due to the kind of fragmentation in different funding and potential lack of coordination, we are not sufficiently taking advantage of the lessons learned across different funding approaches into different kinds of projects. And this is actually making up a barrier for us moving ahead. I think this is a very important point to keep in mind. And another point to keep in mind here is, of course, that we need to look into also the systems approach when we are looking into CDR. We have to remember the infrastructure needs, both when it comes to renewables and when it comes to CO2 transport and storage, for example, underlying what is necessitated for CDR technology in particular. And we need to make sure when we are looking into CDR technology that we define exactly what role different technologies can play. And I think that also reflects the previous speaker, who was a very passionate keynote that we just heard as well. We do not want to overstate or understate the role of CDR here. One thing that we have seen, and one thing that was also mentioned in the panel, is of course also conflation of terms. I think this goes to the heart here. There is still a lot of unknowns. There is still a lot of uncertainty of the role of CDR. And I think that what we need to make sure here is that we really also in the industrial carbon management strategy or the 2040 climate target impact assessment, that we go in and really make sure that we are reducing this conflation of terms and ensuring more research into where we need what kind of technologies and deployment of projects. Here in particular, we actually have a piece right now on the Bologna website on the conflation of terms and the need for clarity, so I hope you all take the opportunity to have a look at that. But in general, I think what we concluded on, and I'm happy it's recorded so everyone can go in and also have an additional look at the session. But what we concluded on is that there is definitely a need for coordination. There is definitely a need for a strategy, which is what has been proposed today. And, excuse me, that as part of this, one of the crucial things that we have to work on is one of the kind of particular characteristics of Europe, which is, of course, that we are fragmented. More so than perhaps if we compare it to the United States, for example. We have different languages, different approaches, different geographies, and we need a strategy maybe more than anyone to remain competitive in this field. And we need to make sure that this research that we want to do, in particular when it comes to public funding, is not only focused on, for example, R&D and the start of projects. It's also focused on how do we actually regulate these kind of markets? How do we avoid, as we heard earlier, moral hazard risks? And how do we ensure the correct role to be played in the right scenarios? So here, I think maybe on a final note to say that we need to make sure that we are researching also across the development of CDR and across different scenarios, that we don't only focus on the technical bit, although that is crucial also for efficiency gains.
Hello, so I'm Chris Sherwood, Secretary General of the Negative Emissions Platform, which is the trade association for the CDR industry. And I'm reporting back on the other panel that was in the first parallel session, which was about the toolkit that the European Union has to stimulate demand for carbon removals. We had Sven Clement, who is a Luxembourgish MP, Sabine Frank from Carbon Market Watch, the NGO, Paolo Piffaretti from CarbonX, which is a company that supports buyers of CDR to find the right supply, and Alexandre Paquot, the director from the European Commission, with Sylvain Delerce from Carbon Gap Moderating. The main topics that were discussed in terms of kind of broad headlines were whether the bottleneck was truly supply or demand, and then also deployment incentives and what the goals of those deployment incentives might be. I would pick out the following key themes for you as topics for discussion which were raised. So first of all, there didn't seem to be a clear consensus as to whether supply or demand were the key bottlenecks. There was quite a lot of discussion of the importance of Europe moving ahead on CDR for competitiveness reasons, particularly in relation to other regions of the world, and also the export potential that Europe has with regards to carbon removals. There was quite a bit of discussion about CDR's role in reaching net zero, not in going beyond net zero, which of course is quite clear, but what is CDR's role in reaching net zero? And I think lack of consensus and some uncertainty around that. There were discussions on the importance of trust and credibility for the sector and of developing good governance, including monitoring, reporting, and verification. Another big theme was the question of technology neutrality, or the importance of a portfolio approach, or diversity of methods, or whichever term you want to use for that. I know technology neutrality has been criticized recently as a term, but generally the importance of making sure that Europe doesn't just put money into 2 or 3 methods, but looks much more broadly. And then another important theme was the importance of defining very clearly how you can use carbon removal credits. And then 2 final ones. So first of all, the challenges around the clarity for investors in terms of creating an investment case. Why would you pay for carbon removals, or why would you invest in carbon removals today? Not yet clear from a kind of an investor perspective, because of a lack of market signals coming from political leadership. And lastly, also the fact that there will be some significant human resource needs that the sector has, which are not yet appreciated and addressed. If I can summarize the key messages of the panelists, panelist by panelist. First of all, I think Sven Clement, his key message was we need to move forward faster. We should have done this some time ago. The key message from Sabine Frank was we urgently need the European Union to clarify the role of carbon removals in terms of the broader policy and also the use that should be allowed and not allowed. And also that governance will be a big challenge for carbon removals going forward. Paolo, I think, could be summarized as saying that we really need certainty on the use. I think a very similar message to what Sabine was saying. And also we need certainty that people who invest in project financing, that those investments can be safe and can be protected. And from the European Commission, from Alexandre Paquot, the Commission is open to ideas, open to contributions and support, particularly with regards to the expert group and the development of methodologies for CDR certification. But there is a big challenge around budget, because with the war in Ukraine and all kinds of other economic difficulties, the European Union's budget will be very tight, and therefore finding money for carbon removals will be very difficult. I think I would summarize with my own personal interpretation of the panel is that the debate, which put the spotlight on big unresolved questions like the use of carbon removal credits, good governance, and what can be done to stimulate the market, show why the Carbon Gap Strategy Initiative is so timely and important. So congratulations to Carbon Gap for publishing this very, very important document and kickstarting this debate at this precise time. And I think to use or abuse my privilege as the rapporteur for the panel, I would say that my key message to the European Union is really that there's a need to accelerate work on a holistic strategy that sends clear market signals to unlock investment in the short term, as well as setting a sustainable long-term framework for what carbon removals does in the longer term. So that's all from me.
Good morning, almost afternoon, I think, everyone. Sam van den Plas, I'm with Carbon Market Watch. We are an NGO here based in Brussels, focusing on fair and effective carbon pricing policies. My panel had a discussion about what's at stake in crediting a future CDR compliance market. The panel was composed of a mix of policymakers, carbon market and carbon removal experts, but I think in total we had several decades of EU ETS policy-making expertise in front of the room. And the panel really helped to create a more nuanced understanding compared to what we saw on the Slido deck this morning, having separate targets versus inclusion of carbon removals in the ETS. The panel took a step back from this dichotomy and looked at purpose and principles behind compliance markets first. So what were they looking at? Cost effectiveness as one key component of that. Markets will seek out your cheapest abatement options throughout the economy and the sectors they cover. That is clearly a benefit, but it's also a risk, because it could mean that markets are too, especially when looking at carbon removals, that they are too strong for their own good, because there is a trade-off between seeking out the lowest cost carbon removals and delivering the highest quality and permanence. One panelist reflected on the negative experience the EU had with allowing about 1.5 billion of CDM and JI credits from the Kyoto Protocol in the EU ETS, which historically contributed to crashing the carbon price. The second aspect which was discussed in detail was environmental integrity. How does this help to deliver and uphold Europe's climate commitments? Impacting the overall cap available in any carbon market is one thing to consider. Also the need to focus on the hard-to-abate sectors. The panel unfortunately did not have time to go into a discussion who is really hard to abate and how much residual emissions do they have and where they sit. A notion was mentioned of the dark side of carbon removals. It was not exactly clarified where they are, but I think somewhere they're hiding in there, and they might be still dependent on production and consumption of fossil fuels specifically. At least that's my take on the dark side, if I may. The need to have safeguards there to uphold environmental integrity. Also the need to look at long-term delivery of net negative emission goals and how that sits kind of uncomfortably with a compliance market for CDR was mentioned. All in all, panelists then agreed that markets can be a tool in the climate policy box to deliver carbon removals, but they're definitely not an aim in itself, not a silver bullet to do all that. So then it became really interesting, because then the discussion moved away from the ETS-only approach, looking at, for example, the inclusion of carbon removals in the effort-sharing regulation, so setting out national binding targets for delivering carbon removals at the national level. Also, a removal trading system was mentioned as a concept, which could add an obligation onto existing EU ETS compliance obligations to deliver a specific amount of carbon removals by the companies covered. Also, the need for dedicated public and private funding came up clearly. Something to be delivered beyond carbon markets approach. Carbon contracts for difference was mentioned specifically. I did not hear a mention of public procurement. I also did not hear specifically the role of the EU ETS Innovation Fund, which generates auctioning revenues to help support such technologies. Definitely worthwhile to consider. In that range of options to consider, I think all in all, the panel's views on including CDR in the European emissions trading system ranged from no, let's not go there, or to not yet. That was kind of the nuances between the discussion. In the meantime, there was broad recognition that this is needed, the support will be needed for CDR. So to retain a signal, to make sure that those technologies can be delivered sooner rather than later. The role of the carbon removal certification framework, recently agreed, came up quite prominently as a testing bed, as a space to see whether things can be developed correctly. And also the importance in the shorter term to separate targets, emission reduction targets from targets for removals was mentioned. I would summarize by saying that the panel broadly supported what is mentioned in Carbon Gap's carbon removal strategy presented here today to deprioritize inclusion of CDR in the European emissions trading system, but be cautious and focus on a wide range of potential alternatives first. And I hope with that I correctly reflected the outcomes of this. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rachel Ardiff, and I'm going to be reporting on the justice-orientated aspect of carbon dioxide removals. So first, it was a really wonderful session, and I'd like to thank Carbon Gap for actually including this in this conference. I think that it is a really not spoken about and not sufficiently considered aspect of carbon removals and potentially of climate change technology in general. So for anyone who missed it, I strongly encourage to watch back on YouTube. I think that the panel had a really good mixture of theoretical and practical considerations. So this came from business perspectives in the Global South. It came from researchers who worked at different levels, and also people who create, or person, Bella, who creates toolboxes for project developers as they attempt to include justice into their carbon dioxide projects. There was a really important distinction between looking at the global level and also community level of justice considerations. What does the global north owe to the global south, and also how do we engage with communities, and how do we ensure that we learn from the people who are most affected? So there was first a consideration of who benefits from carbon dioxide removal, who benefits, who pays, and who gets those resources exported. Price was something that I found particularly interesting. There is a large focus on affordability. I think there can almost be an ideological focus on price. I think this was something that was mentioned by Wim as you look at carbon dioxide removals. And I think that as we focus on making something cheaper and cheaper, you can lose investment in justice. I think that you consider this in other aspects and other resources, that if you make something cheaper and cheaper, the quality is not going to be as good. So if your only focus in Europe is to make the cheapest carbon dioxide possible, then you are not probably considering justice adequately and considering the people that it most affects. For this reason, there was a scope. The first panel that I attended this morning talked about ensuring that the scope for carbon dioxide removals was kept as broad as possible so that we don't eliminate anything and we allow the market to decide. But there was a call for narrowing the scope for justice's sake, not just to look at the price, but to look at, for example, if we look at afforestation, the plantation-style forests that have been planted in the global south and the effect that this had on the local people. It is very important to narrow the scope of what we consider a sufficient carbon dioxide removal. There was also a large discussion of public participation and procedural justice, so how to ensure that the public are actively listened to, and most importantly, actively listened to the whole way through. Not something that is, like, not that they're only talked to in the very beginning, but 10 years down the line, at the end of the project. Not only for justice aspects and to make sure that marginalized communities get listened to, but also for the wealth of knowledge that's held within the public, for what they know about their own land and for what they know about what's going to affect them and what's going to work in the long term. Allowances and methods need to be ensured that there is full communication, participation, and education of everyone with whom this affects. I thought a really key and obvious example is things like translators in town halls, to ensure that everyone knows what's going on and that everyone can have a say. Emily also talked about the lack of pseudo voice, to ensure that you are aware of the power dynamics as you go in talking to communities, that you have as a researcher, that you have potentially as someone with a lot of money from different public, or from private investment. That you don't put words into people's mouths and that you don't bring them to foregone conclusions, that you make sure that there is genuine participation. There is a need, obviously, there is a need to ramp up CDR as quickly as possible, but there is a need to ensure that there is engagement. These need to be twin priorities and they need to be prioritized the entire way through. There was a discussion of CDR for climate. This is as we moved outside of the community level and looked more on the global level. As you looked at CDR for climate reparations and the importance of looking at the historic responsibility, and I think this ties very nicely back to our keynote speech of what the global North owes the global South. But it needs to be ensured that this cannot be used as a distraction, that we don't talk about what's owed before we even reach the point of peak emissions, that we focus on mitigating what we have now and that we don't talk about reparations for something that we haven't even finished harming. We need to ensure that harm is stopped now. There was talk about the accessibility of language and to ensure that there is education as well as, that there's education, but also that justice is helped through things like employment and knowledge of local people on the ground. I think there's lots of reason to be optimistic about the inclusion of justice and CDR going forward. If you look at Justice 40 in the States, where 40% has to be tied back to marginalized community, of the climate justice principles that are installed in EU climate law, we are only at the start of a massive CDR scale-up. We can learn from lessons, both positive and negative, from a variety of projects from around the world. Europe should be a leader and should focus on being a leader not only in green tech, but also in climate justice.
Thank you very much. I hope this was helpful to those who, well, to everyone on the panels that they could not attend. And we encourage you to follow them online if you wish to listen to the whole conversation. I think this was a great overview of the key points. I'm very grateful for your conclusions, all four of you. And I would like to conclude this event with final remarks from our very own colleague, Devina Banerjee, who will be taking us on the final words that we would like you to bring home with you.
So I'm now the only thing standing between you and lunch. Thank you so much for coming, and a big thank you to the whole team at Carbon Gap for shaping this event. It's so amazing to see such a diverse group brought together. We've got policymakers, we've got civil society, we've got business, all coming together to discuss the very important topic of CDR scale-up, responsible scale-up in Europe. It's clear that we've had a lot of rich discussions, differing viewpoints, debate, but what is clear is that while we've made a really good start, there's a lot more ground to cover. So we need research and development funding to get much needed solutions off the ground. We need the deployment incentives to get projects to megaton and gigaton scale. We need to think about the long-term deployment trajectory for CDR and how that's embedded into policy. And very importantly, we need to think about justice and social considerations when it comes to carbon removal. Carbon Gap are all here during the lunch break. We really want to hear your views on what you've heard today. So please come and find us. And in the longer term, take a look at our report, get in touch with us over the coming weeks. We want to discuss what your ideas are and get your viewpoints, and coming all together, let's work towards a comprehensive, ambitious, long-term strategy for Europe. Thanks.